Well, welcome everybody. I think looking at the screen, that was a great idea, Cindy, to stop screen sharing for a minute so we can see each other until we get to the slides later. It looks like everybody's here, but I'll have Mr. Estes do a roll call for the City Council, and then I'll have ask Mr. Moore to do a roll call for the Planning Commission, and just that way we'll have it on the record who's here for this joint work session of the City Council and Astoria Planning Commission. So, Mr. Estes.
Okay, Councilor Herman.
Here.
Councilor Rocca.
Here.
Councilor Hilton.
Here.
Councilor Brownson.
Here.
And Mayor Jones.
Here.
Great, I'll ask for my commissioners. Commissioner Corcoran. You're muted. Can you mute yourself?
Come back to me.
Yeah, Commissioner Corcoran, are you present?
Yes.
Thank you. Commissioner Womack. You're also silent. We're not picking up any audio from you, sir. We'll skip Mr. Womack. Oh, Commissioner Womack raised his hand in presence. Commissioner Croning.
Here.
Commissioner Price.
Here.
Commissioner Henry.
Here.
Vice President Fitzpatrick.
Here.
And President Moore is present.
Okay, thank you. So I thank everybody for gathering this evening. This is actually something that I'm pretty excited about. It's going to be very interesting. And housing, of course, see, Mr. Estes thinks I'm being sarcastic. I'm actually not. I actually think this is going to be very interesting because there are some interesting proposals that we're going to be talking about and that the council will be providing some direction so that the Planning Commission's efforts will be very focused and targeted in an effective manner. And so that we also can hear the input from Planning Commission and councilors on some of these topics that are in some cases could be controversial, but it's hopefully really make some forward progress on how we can address the housing issue in Astoria over the next year. So without further ado, I'll turn it over for an introduction to Mr. Estes.
Thank you, Mayor. So I'm going to give a bit of a chronology in terms of some planning processes that went into development of the county housing study, which was completed a couple years ago. And I know that members of the Planning Commission and City Council have been able to review that document, and we're going to be having some direct discussion about some recommendations included in that study a little bit later on. But I kind of want to talk a little bit about some things that led up to the creation of the housing study. So about 15 years ago, the city started their buildable lands inventory update. And a buildable lands inventory is something that is required by the state of Oregon to analyze and assess how much available land for residential and what they call employment lands are available in a community, in a city. And that is a requirement of the state it's a requirement of the state to have a 20-year land supply of developable residential and employment lands in your urban growth boundary. And to be able to set the stage for this, Astoria has a little bit of an anomaly in that our city limits boundary is outside of our urban growth boundary. Most communities in the state, their urban growth boundary is outside of their city limits. And then whenever they want to develop or they have a need to develop, they'll annex that land. We have the opposite. When our urban growth boundary was created in the 1970s, when all urban growth boundaries were created, our UGB was commensurate with our city limits line, and a group which is still around today called the Thousand Friends of Oregon sued and won, saying that our urban growth boundary was too big. It had too much land in it for needed development in the future, and it was ratcheted inside of our city limits. So when we took on the buildable lands inventory analysis, we were looking at how much land is there still for development or redevelopment within our community. And there is a whole process and a procedure which is established by the Department of Land Conservation and Development, DLCD, on how that has to be analyzed. So after several years of analysis and meetings through the Planning Commission recommended approval to the City Council, and ultimately the City Council stated that they wanted more information. They felt that at the time, perhaps the analysis which was done didn't include enough of a need for additional land to be added within our urban growth boundary in the future. And they asked and staff to go back and do additional analysis. Some of the conclusions that came out of that buildable land inventory was that there is a federally owned piece of property, zoned residential, over by Emerald Heights, that under state law must count and apply towards vacant available residential land, but in reality, it's not going to be developed because the federal government held that as a wildlife preserve. And as long as the federal government held that land as a wildlife preserve, then that wouldn't be developed. The interesting thing is the state of Oregon does not count federal land held in wildlife preserves as being eligible to remove that land as being developable. We had to count it as saying that is available land for meeting our land need. Additionally, there was a finding that said that we had a deficit of low density residential lands in our community. That is for more like single family residential type of development that we didn't have enough to meet our required 20-year land supply. Well, but the council at the time felt that that maybe there was even greater need that wasn't analyzed, and what the council asked for was rather analysis being done via GIS or by digital maps. They wanted site visits of every property in the city limits of Astoria and analysis done on the street in person. So we hired another consultant, Patrick Wingard. Some of you may remember Patrick. He is actually now a Department of Land Conservation and Development representative down in Eugene, but we hired Patrick Wingard to do that walking analysis of the entire city limits of Astoria. And come to find out that there was a little bit more additional land that was needed. It wasn't tremendous in terms of how much was needed, but there was a gain in terms of single family or low density residential land. So that was adopted about 12 years ago, give or take. So after that, the city council asked for some housing analysis to be completed, and our community development department staff at the time completed that housing analysis, and there were some recommendations at the time of what can we do to be able to address housing need. And there were some recommendations for some code amendments to be able to be done at that time. And the council was not looking at wanting to move forward with an urban growth boundary amendment at that point in time, but really looking at what can we do to add some additional housing within our existing urban growth boundary. There were requests to be able to consider amendments to our accessory dwelling unit ordinance. And so we moved forward with that at the Planning Commission level. And throughout that process, there started to be concerns raised by citizens that some of the amendments proposed, which were adding additional height or additional buildable area through lot coverage or setbacks, community members felt that that was not appropriate for our city. And ultimately, the city council had the Planning Commission and staff stop working on code amendments dealing with additional provisions that would allow denser development within residential zones, but said continue working on accessory dwelling units to allow them more readily. And that went through the Planning Commission and was ultimately adopted by the city council. So then subsequent to that, the members of city councils and the county commission at one of their joint meetings discussed the possibility of having a joint county housing study, and that each one of the communities in Clatsop County had housing needs, but could there be a greater look at analysis countywide? And so the city of Astoria and all the cities in Clatsop County partnered in development of the county housing study, which was completed a couple years ago. And the buildable lands inventory, which I'd mentioned, and all the other analysis was included in this analysis. And so what came out of this county housing study were some implementing recommendations for the various communities. So we're going to be going over some of those, as I said, more specifically tonight. So after the county housing study was adopted, affordable housing was becoming a statewide issue, and the legislature passed laws that required cities over 2,500 people to update their codes to be able to promote more accessory dwelling unit usage. And we've gone through a process recently, and that was actually adopted by the city council earlier this week. So that has been addressed, and it's required by state law that we do that work, and it's been completed. There were some additional provisions included in that legislation which applied to cities 10,000, population of 10,000 and more, to address missing middle housing, to be able to provide additional residential densities in residential zones, to be able to provide some additional housing. And we'll go into more about what missing middle is in a little bit. So Astoria, as we all know, has been right below 10,000 people since World War II. And the Department of Land Conservation and Development, which we work with in developing the codes, wanted the city of Astoria to develop the missing middle code provisions because they were saying, at some point in time, you could get above 10,000, and they're suggesting that we do it now as a proactive approach. In the end, the city of Astoria chose not to go that route as we hadn't achieved the 10,000 population threshold and conveyed to Department of Land Conservation and Development. If and when we do reach that threshold, we'll go through that process at that point in time. So the Planning Commission over the past year or so initiated some code amendments, as I was talking about earlier, to address the required accessory dwelling unit language that's mandated by the state, and also started looking at some other housing types like group housing as a part of this code amendments to factor in with the county housing study. So this last fall, the Planning Commission moved the accessory dwelling unit language forward and put a pause on the group housing language because of some consternation coming from citizens about that type of use. So during the Planning Commission meetings, there was some concern raised by some commissioners with some of the missing middle concepts that are encouraged by the Department of Land Conservation and Development, and also which are included in the county housing study as some implementation items to be able to consider. So in our community development director, Meg Leatherman, putting together a scope of work to move forward on the next round of housing code amendments, it was suggested that we have this meeting tonight for the Planning Commission and the City Council to dialogue about the recommendations in the housing study. And what the mayor will ultimately be doing is we'll be going through in each one of the strategies and between Ms. Leatherman and myself be providing some background information about what these recommendations could mean. The mayor will be facilitating conversation and dialogue between the members of the Planning Commission and City Council, and then ultimately looking to the City Council to provide some guidance to staff of the Planning Commission on what they would like us to be able to work on moving forward. The purpose of this is if there's a provision or a recommendation in the county housing study which is really just a non-starter, a no-go, it would be helpful to be able to understand that now, so that we are not pursuing something that ultimately there's really just no interest from the council in considering. And we're not asking for the council to say, hey, what are we ready to approve? But it's what are you wanting the Planning Commission and staff to investigate, to be able to dive in deeper, and to be able to work through a code process further to be able to look at. This is if you say, hey, we're interested in setting minimum density standards. This is not saying, hey, we're wanting to actually do that. It's worth digging into and looking at more. And so that's what at least we're going to be looking for this evening from this whole process. So that's my introduction. Are there any questions before I turn it over to Ms. Leatherman and she starts working us through some of the provisions in the county housing study?
Hey, Brett, this is Bob Levine.
Yes.
I know I'm not on either of those commissions, but are you looking for any public comment tonight at all?
That would be the mayor to decide, since he runs the meeting.
So typically at a work session, we typically have, frankly, few people attending. So public comment is not an issue. Public comment is not typically formally a part of a work session. On a few occasions when we've had a work session end with enough time and there were one or two members of the public who wanted to say something, I've invited them to do so. I would say we're going through quite a long list of items. When we are finished with all the discussion, if it's not too late, I would certainly be happy to offer up public comment to whoever's not a member of the council or the commission that wants to make a public comment.
Okay,
But
thank
not
you.
necessarily looking for public comment on each individual topic as we go through it.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other questions before we get rolling?
You know, go ahead, Commissioner Price.
Thank you. Yes, Cindy Price. Mr. City Manager, that was the most concise and entertaining summary of the history of what's been going on with the development code and urban growth boundary that I've heard. Thank you. That was very helpful.
Oh,
And I'll just wanted to add a general comment for the city councilors, just kind of following up on Mr. Estes' comments, that, you know, as you go through these different items that were in the county housing study that Ms. Leatherman is going to tee up for us, you know, so many of them have to do with some aspect or another of increasing density, increasing allowable height or bulk, increasing maximum lot coverage, decreasing minimum lot size, decreasing setbacks, decreasing parking standards, and many other things that we'll go through one at a time. They're all about more density. And certainly what we've all seen in the past is when proposals come forward to increase density in some way, members in the neighborhoods, typically there's opposition. And I think we just need to understand that up front. And if there are things that we tell the Planning Commission that we would like them to work on and explore further and possibly bring a recommendation, I think, you know, it's kind of incumbent upon us to know if these are things that are going to generate opposition, that, you know, are we willing to stick up for good recommendations despite opposition? Because the worst thing that can happen is to have, you know, the Planning Commission spend a year developing code amendments at our direction, and then as soon as there's some community opposition to those code amendments, we all say, oh no, never mind, we weren't really serious about it. So I would just have that as a broad statement at the beginning. I think if we're going to give direction, we need to understand the ramifications. If there are no other questions, then I guess we'll turn it over to Ms. Leatherman.
All right, thank you, Mayor. Jen, is my screen shared now?
Not right now.
Okay.
My audio audible by anyone?
You still have the option to do that.
So, okay, thank you. Sorry, you're hard to hear. Okay, thank you, Mayor, councilors, commissioners. In 2019, the county and its cities undertook a study of current and projected housing needs and conditions and came up with recommended strategies to address housing supply with local needs. A result of this study was the Clatsop County Housing Strategies Report, as we've heard. The recommendations were broken down into 5 different categories: land supply, policy and development code, development incentives, funding tools and uses, and regional collaboration and capacity building. My presentation tonight is solely going to focus on the policy and development code section. Again, as Brett stated, with the goal of getting some direction from the group on a future code amendment. So the first strategy is to adopt a supportive and inclusive comprehensive plan. And just right now, what we're planning on doing is to have the city staff address that through part of our code amendment. So I'm going to move on to the specific strategies that deal with development code.
And Mayor and Council and Commissioners, it's going to be kind of a tag team between Ms. Leatherman and myself throughout all this. And so you'll see us kind of going back and forth. It's, with this, we've got, whenever we do any code amendments, we're looking at, are there portions of the comprehensive plan which need to be updated commensurately with those code amendments? And so that will be looked at, as a part of this whole process as we move forward. Go ahead, Meg.
So the second recommended strategy in the Policy and Development Code section is to establish minimum density standards within residential zones. This is the most direct method to ensure land is used efficiently and to adopt these minimum density standards and they can be different based on the different zones. A minimum density standard would prohibit residential developments that do not meet the intent of the zone. For example, large lot detached homes would be prohibited in higher density residential zones, but the minimum density standard would allow for small lot detached houses or townhomes. A good example of a minimum density standard that Astoria already has is the Mill Pond zone, which has established a minimum density standard of 18 dwelling units per acre. To accomplish this, it is recommended that we prohibit or significantly limit single-family homes in our high density zone, which is R3, and to only allow single-family homes in the R2 zone, which is our medium density zone. Only if the single family home can meet the minimum density or maximum lot size requirements. Also, as part of the strategy, it's recommended that the city continue to allow the use and repair of single family homes in these zones and allow the conversion of larger single family homes into multi-family dwellings. One second here. So the development code currently allows single family homes in all residential zones. And the code does not have maximum lot sizes and minimum densities for the R2 zone. It has minimum lot sizes and maximum densities, so the inverse. The conversion of single family homes into multifamily is allowed in the R2 as a conditional use and is permitted outright in the R3. But I would like to point out that the associated standards, such as parking and lot size, highly restrain the conversion of single family to multifamily. And on this slide that I have here, you can see the uses that are permitted in each residential zone outright, and then those that are conditional. And I think that's all I have for strategy number 2. If we want to go ahead and open it up for discussion, or actually, if Brett, if you want to kind of talk about maybe some history or some of the nuances.
Sure. So, Ms. Leatherman, if you go back one slide. So on the first bullet where it says update development codes to prohibit or significantly limit new single family detached housing in high density zones like the R3 zone. So where we've got the most amount of vacant land, residentially zoned land in the community, is many of those areas are zoned R3. So think about Tongue Point. That whole area is zoned R3 multifamily. So under the current development code, there could be a new subdivision built out there, which would be a single family detached subdivision and be permitted within our zoning ordinance. What the recommendation here is to say, okay, if we have areas of town which are zoned high density, that we should be looking to achieve and realize higher residential densities in that area. And so saying that, if Tongue Point were to be able to redevelop that, it would be built at a duplex or multifamily residential density. And on the second bullet, what it's saying is, okay, in that medium density zone, which is supposed to include single family, right now includes single family homes and duplexes, and you can build multifamily with the conditional use, say, you know, the target here is this will be the middle ground between our low density R1 zone and our higher density R3. So if there is going to be single family homes in that zone, they're going to be built at a higher density standard. And this is, there are provisions in zoning ordinances elsewhere in the state which deal with this and say, if there's going to be development in a specific zone, development must happen at a minimum threshold to be able to be allowed. And it's trying to achieve, again, a certain residential capacity within a community. But as the third bullet says, is saying, if in the R2 or the R3 zones, if there are any existing single family homes, it's allowing that use to be able to continue and not make them non-conforming, and it's not taking away necessarily a specific right that's already given to them, and it allows that to be able to continue into the future. So that's all the additional comments that I have on that, Mayor. I want to turn it over to you for discussion.
Okay, thanks, Mr. Estes. And why don't we start with, how about members of the Planning Commission? Do you have any comments or thoughts on it? And we may or may not be able to see you on the screen, so use that raise hand function on Zoom, or just unmute yourself. Can they unmute themselves, Jen, or do you have to unmute them? You can unmute yourself or use the raise hand function, either way.
Do we want to drop the screen share while we have this discussion, maybe?
If we can, if that's easy to go back and forth, let's do that.
And can I test my audio? Can anyone hear me?
Yes, loud and clear. Councilor Price, I think you, why don't you go ahead?
Well, thank you. I have one simple question and one basic question. The simple question is, did the council adopt the county housing plan? Has that been adopted? Or, I mean.
Yeah, it's not, it has been accepted is the word that we use, where it is not law. And so,
Okay.
you know, because it's not
there
law.
was no vote on it and all of that to say this, because this leads actually to my bigger question, which is to ask really the council, this is my question, is really, what do you want? What do you want? Do you want a city that is 10 to 15,000 people with inclusive housing and that comports with maximum or some number of standards that sort of equate to density? If that's, you know, sort of what you want, then I'm pretty sure that the Astoria Planning Commission, along with the city staff, knows how to write code for that. But my question has always been, what am I writing code for? And I understand that there are recommendations and some things are actually already state law, but is that what Astoria wants? Have you had that discussion?
So we haven't had that discussion as to, you know, to use one of your examples, what is the desired population of Astoria? I mean, what Mr. Estes has said, you know, for many years, it's been hovering right at that 9,500 to 9,900. It goes back and forth by a few hundred. According to the county housing study, it's going to go up by about, 1.5% a year or something. The new census is going to come out and probably say we're just over 10,000, or it may still say we're 9,994. I don't know. But we have not had the discussion, how big do we want to get? I think the discussion that we've had indirectly has been that we want there to be adequate housing for the people that want housing. I don't think that we are interested in building let's have a flood of 5,000 new living units in the city so that 5,000 people can move here. But certainly I'm hearing from lots of people that at certain types of housing are very, very difficult to find, even for people who already live here. And I'll speak for myself, let the other counselors speak. I think that we do want more housing at certain areas that have certain types of housing that have been identified in the housing study, in which we certainly welcome comment from the planning commissioners on. And that would mean there are more people in Astoria, but I wouldn't say, I think 15,000 would be on not probably very reasonable of where it might go. But we do want more housing. And the multifamily housing unit that's been not moving forward currently, but planned for Tongue Point with about 130 multifamily units. I mean, that alone would probably put the city over that 10,000 threshold if that gets built and gets filled with people. I haven't heard any counselor say he or she is interested in some dramatic transformation of the city from what we have now to a metropolis. But what I would envision is areas of town, individual lots and groups of lots that do have higher density. So for example, if you've been by Safeway lately, you've seen that the development plan for that lot, George Brew's lot, a former lot, immediately west of Safeway, that's been graded now, and that's expected to continue moving forward if everything gets resolved with the engineering permits. And that'll be about 60 new units of a combination of permanent residential units and short-term rentals. So there's 60 additional housing units that pop up in one relatively small lot. So that's, I mean, in my mind, to answer your question in a very long way, Commissioner Price, that's kind of what I envision, is that you've got little pinpoints around the city where there's much higher density, but not a dramatic transformation of the entire cityscape.
So I would kind of interpret that, if I could just carry on a little conversation here just for another minute, as you're being interested in, I'll just speak to you personally at this point, since I don't know how everybody else feels, but you're interested in sort of preserving the livability of our established neighborhoods, and in areas that are new or that are more commercial, including density there, by all the things that we've talked about, setbacks and, substandard lots and this, that, and the other. That's what I'm sort of hearing.
So I would
because some of the things, a lot of the things that we spend a lot of time on at the Planning Commission, and you will too when we send something to you, is the small things like setbacks and this and that, and there's small things that take place between maybe one property on a block, but it can really change the nature of the neighborhood. It's not building 60 units in an empty lot, in flat land somewhere. You know what I mean?
Yes, and so I would say that no, I am interested in seeing some changes in existing neighborhoods. So I'm not confining my interest in amendments to only currently undeveloped lots. But Commissioner Fitzpatrick, you had your hand up.
Yes, thank you, Mayor Jones. I would also like to thank Mr. Estes, City Manager Estes, for his efforts in discussing the history of this and the urban growth boundary. And I would point out that we do have a very unusual situation in Astoria in that our borders are not artificial. They are there and they are permanent. Three sides, we are surrounded by water. And so the only direction we could grow is to the east, and that seems to be federal lands and so on. So we do have some restrictions that don't apply to other places like Salem or Portland, where they make the laws that tell us that we have to come up with housing supply and so on. I don't want to get too far into that for a number of reasons, but getting back to Ms. Price's statement, the population is going to grow based on the number of people that want to move here. And so we can plan for 15,000 people, but if they don't show up, we're going to stay at 10 as we have for several decades. Getting back to the portion that had just been presented up there, on page 5, it states that 73% of the needed units are projected to be ownership units, with 27% being rental. And I would point out that most ownership units will be single family. Sorry, I'm used to calling them SFRs, or single family residences. I know that we're trying to take the word family out tonight. Hopefully we can use family, but nonetheless, ownership units will be mostly single family. Some will be condos. Very few of those will be multifamily. I did ask I asked Ms. Leatherman for numbers about single family and multifamily that have been built over the past 10 years, and I do want to go over that. But getting back, when we ensure that properties are zoned for higher density and not developed at lower densities, and this is page 7, strategy 1 from the housing report, and then also from the post that we had up there. Anyhow, I would like to suggest that we make an exception for smaller lots in an R3 or R2. And by smaller, I mean somewhere around 4,500 square feet. And I'm not sure what our current minimum lot size is in R3, but I hope that we can allow 4,500 square foot lots, and that a single family residence would be more appropriate on smaller R3 and R2 lots than multifamily. So I would hope that we would allow that exception there, rather than making it a requirement to put multifamily in, because if we need a single family residence and it doesn't make sense to put multifamily in, nothing gets built. So exceptions for situations like that, if we have a 10 or 12,000 square foot R3 lot, I think it should be built as multifamily. I don't think we should allow single family on that. But I do think that when we do a smaller lot, that we do allow a single family on there. And that would fall under page 10, strategy 1, number 4, encourage a variety of housing types, because we definitely need, according to the housing study and my experience working in the housing industry in the county in the past 18 years, we need more single family, not just multifamily. And I think I will leave it at that for right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Fitzpatrick. I think, does anyone else have a comment right now? Feel free to just unmute yourself and chime in.
Mr. Mayor, I have some thoughts.
Please.
This is Commissioner Moore. So in one of my concerns about is we need to be cognizant of increasing the economic opportunity such that developers come in and start tearing down houses to capitalize on those economic opportunities. So if we're talking about increasing density in the R1s and 2s, I would be very concerned that that we make it too affordable for some of our older homes that maybe aren't on the registry to be removed in favor of more dense structures that don't necessarily add any character to the city, but they might bring more people. So that's one thought that I think we should keep in mind. As Commissioner Fitzpatrick was talking about lot sizes, I know all 3 of the zones for single family, the minimum lot size is 5,000 feet. I can see lowering that a little bit, really on all levels. Most of the zones, require a certain amount extra to build a multifamily. You need another 1,500 or 2,500 square feet, for example. I could see achieving the increase in density by not changing the minimum lot size by much, but by removing the requirements to have more land to build a duplex, that kind of thing. But again, I'm real concerned about creating minimum densities creating opportunities to have existing housing supply removed in favor of new ones, because I don't want to lose the character that our city has.
Thank you.
So, Mr. Estes or Ms. Leatherman, do either one of you want to address that idea of what existing protections are in place that would keep a developer from purchasing a home? And at what point is a home protected from being torn down for the purpose of putting up a multiplex?
Yeah, I mean, right now, the protections that are in place are if a property is designated historic. So that is the protection that's in place. And I think what Commissioner Moore was referring to is concerns about properties which are not designated historic, maybe have historic character. And if there was a property in one of those zones that it was not designated historic, the vulnerabilities that could be there. What I would say is that what is, so there are no recommendations in the county housing study which talk about adjusting the R1 zone. So if you look at that, there's provisions for R2 and R3, but R1 is, which is the low density residential zone, is not included for any densification provisions. Now R2, there's language about adding prohibitions on single family residences except for certain lot sizes. There are recommendations that Ms. Leatherman is going to be getting to in some subsequent slide, which does have recommendations for additional height and building mass in the R3 zone. And we do have R3 single family residences in R3 zone. My single family house is in an R3 zone. So my house is designated historic, but there are others in my neighborhood which are not. So that's I think the point that Commissioner Moore is getting at, trying to boil it down a little bit more. Meg, did you have something you wanted to chime in on?
Well, I was just gonna state that right now, what protects it from someone coming in and tearing down a single family home and doing a multiplex is the zone. Whatever we zone it, if we allow multifamily in the R1, then they could do that. In the R2, it's a conditional use, so they couldn't without a conditional use application. So that's one way of controlling that also, besides the historic component.
And of course, other communities worry about those homes with character being torn down just to put up a McMansion. And that's kind of the opposite extreme. So, Commissioner Moore's concern is that you tear it down if we make it if we make it possible to put up a multifamily home where they're currently not allowed, tear down a home with character to put up a multifamily and make a profit. I don't think that's any different or worse than tearing that same home down to put up a McMansion.
Yeah, and I think, as we get through the slides, there's going to be a variety of different housing types that are what we would call, higher density that might be more compatible for Astoria in certain areas. And that's, I think, part of the discussion is what housing types would be beneficial, because we want to solve the affordable housing problem, or at least workforce housing. We want the rental rates keep going up, right? And so this is one way to do that. So it is trying to strike that balance between being able to do that, to meet the compatibility and character of the city at the same time with addressing the issues we have with the housing costs. And I do see a counselor, Raka, has a hand up, and another person. I don't know if I'm sorry, not to take over the meeting from you, Mayor. I don't know if you see that.
Counselor Raka.
Okay.
Sure. Well, Commissioner Price asked a more general question of what the council wants, and I would like to give you a more general answer without getting into the specifics of exactly how we would get there. And speaking for this counselor, we are in a situation right now where there are so few homes available for sale that prices are being bid up to the point where it would be difficult for anyone to afford unless they're moving here from San Francisco or Seattle, having sold a home there. So I want us to try, through the changes that we make, to create a situation where the woman who works in one of our restaurants and her husband who manages a lodging property can actually fulfill the dream they've had for years now of actually being able to buy a home. Or when we have somebody who's hired by the college as a mid-level manager, or by the city, or by a company, that they can actually find some place to buy and live. I think that's my goal as a counselor. I don't want to have 15,000 people here necessarily. And, you know, Astoria has sort of, over a couple hundred years, has found its sort of watermark for what population seems to work here. I just want for those people who do work here to be able to have a place to live. And we're not there right now. So that's my bottom line.
So Ms. Sullivan, just to be fair to the other guests that aren't on the commission, I'm going to ask you to hold public comment until later. And just keep the discussion to counselors and commissioners for now. So Councilor Herman. And you're muted.
Thank you. I do support exploring this strategy further. Commissioner Fitzpatrick and Chairman Moore make some great, important points about ensuring that we retain Astoria's special character and not pass some sort of ordinance that would cause historic homes. They may not be listed as historic, but nonetheless, they add to our overall character. We don't want to do something that would encourage a developer to tear them down for multifamily housing. But that said, I think it's definitely worth exploring prohibiting single-family housing future developments in the R3 zone. Particularly, I don't know if we can do this, but particularly if there's a way we can incentivize workforce housing. And that may not be doable. But I think it's worth exploring prohibiting single-family housing in the R3 zone. But a question I had is, what if a single-family house there now were to burn down? Would that homeowner be able to rebuild as a single-family house?
Yeah, do you want to answer that, Brett? Or
No, you can go for it.
I would just the development code has a non-conforming use provisions that that address that. Basically, I mean, in that kind of situation, yes, they could rebuild it if it was burnt down. Now, if it's construction based on choice, there's a certain percentage that's allowed. I think it's 25%, something to that degree. But if it's a whole house has gone down, then yes.
Okay, thank you.
And I would note that what's on the slide for the recommendation was update development codes to prohibit or significantly limit new single-family detached housing. So not necessarily to outright prohibit it, possibly require, as I think along the lines of what Commissioner Fitzpatrick was suggesting, that to allow single-family homes, but on a much smaller lot, with 5 feet between houses, or a cottage cluster type thing, or maybe, I'm not sure what it's referred to in Mill Pond, where the houses are just a few feet apart, but very densely packed single-family homes. If that meets a consumer need, which right now it does seem to. I know there are people looking for small starter homes that are typically tiny homes on tiny lots, and there aren't many of those.
And just to add on to that, Mayor, one of the recommendations is to allow the continuation of single-family homes and the repair of them and restoration of them as well. So it's not saying to get rid of them completely, but just from like the R3, basically, like Councilor Jones said. Sorry, Herman. Sorry.
And
Ms. Leatherman, you want to throw that slide up again, just with the
yeah.
We can just have sort of final comments on this one before we move on to the next one.
Yeah, and Mayor, you're correct. The Mill Pond neighborhood, I mean, those lots are, I think, closer to 3,000 square feet. I mean, they're pretty small with very shallow setbacks, but those are considered single-family residences in Mill Pond.
Right. So I guess we'll ask if the commissioners have additional thoughts, just speak up at any time. Otherwise, I'll just ask the council, what guidance do we want to provide the commission on looking into these areas? So for myself, I'm in favor of looking into these recommendations on this slide.
I'm enthusiastically in favor.
Yeah, I think they're reasonable and worthy.
I'm with, excuse me, can you hear me? I'm with moving forward on this slide as well.
I just want a real quick comment. My sense here is that, what we're talking about here is creating more homes available for sale with all our limitations here in Astoria with buildable lots. We're just trying to find ways to get single family homes in different places, if I'm hearing this right. And we're at this point in time not really addressing workforce housing or necessarily affordable housing or apartments.
And I think those topics are going to come up on subsequent slides later this evening.
Yeah, no, real quick, just to touch on that, and I mean, we're not going to go into a whole lot of detail about that, but we have to remember that in the state of Oregon, what is referred to as inclusionary zoning has only recently been allowed in the state, which is where a jurisdiction requires that if there's going to be a multifamily development, that a certain number of units be affordable. And the only way that it's allowed now in the state of Oregon is if the city pays the difference to the developer. And so our problem comes to that source of money to be able to pay the difference to incentivize it. So that's kind of the nexus which is allowed by the state.
And when we talk about single family homes, we also are talking about duplexes and triplexes as well, right? I mean, not just freestanding homes, but just also, no, you're shaking your head. No, we're just on single family homes here.
Yeah, I mean, so so when we're talking about single family, we're talking about one unit on one lot. So that'd be a single family home. There is a provision. So you can have multifamily structures that are divided down a common, a common building line, but that development is still considered multifamily in terms of how it's looked at zoning wise.
As this discussion goes on forward, to address the initial point that Commissioner Price made, I'm not looking at a giant increase in population here. In fact, there's not one forecast. I think the focus really is what's been discussed here. If a person wants to move to this couple things, person wants to move to this town, that there's some options for them, some housing that they can find. And then also having enough housing stock so it frees up some of the smaller, less expensive stuff for starter homes. So I think that's really important. It's going to be more discussion going on, but I do want to stress that even if we don't have much of a gain in population, we just don't have the housing to allow people the flexibility to find something that's suitable for their particular needs. And that's what we need to do.
Okay,
Mr. Mayor, if I could throw one more thought out. We have a lot of single family homes in R3 currently, especially between Irving and Franklin on the North Slope. That's all R3 and along the Marine Drive by the bridge. Pretty much all I mean, the majority single-family homes. And I'll direct this question towards Mr. Estes and Ms. Leatherman. Our undeveloped R3 lands, especially out near Blue Ridge and the Tongue Point, would it be worthwhile to pursue an R4, a new zone that imposes these restrictions, these minimum lot size restrictions, so we're not imposing or risking the redevelopment of our existing supply in the developed R3s that are downtown? Would it make sense to rezone the areas that are undeveloped so that we're sure that we get the density that we're hoping for out there? And just to create a wild idea, I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts on that.
I think it's worth exploring, and I don't know if, R4 might be what it's called. And I think what later on, we do have a zone called, it's CR, compact residential, that is not actually delineated anywhere on the map. It hasn't been utilized, and there's history to that as well. That law allows cottage cluster. So I think there's different options, but I think we could explore that. Brett, more.
Yeah, I mean, I think it can be explored, but I think there can also be specifics in terms of the application of the prohibition of single-family detached units on certain areas. Maybe if there's a focus, if we keep the R3 zone, we focus and apply it on those areas that are not platted yet, perhaps.
Okay, I think we could move on to the next slide then.
Could I make one comment, Mayor Jones?
Please, yeah, please.
Okay, Commissioner Fitzpatrick here. I do appreciate Councilor Rocca's statement about the middle class, working class. They're trying to buy homes here and they just don't exist and the prices are being driven up. I've gone over some notes. I've spoken to the council at least 3 times in the past 10 years about the importance of that type of housing. There has been considerable discussion about workforce housing, the importance of workforce housing and continuing to provide workforce housing. And I have continued to ask the city council, and I will again at this point in our work session, to remember that there is a lot of missing housing for people that maybe even want to own single family or have a larger home. People where a household where 2 people are working full-time at above minimum wage, and or professionals coming from out of the area, doctors or people that are going to work for the county in a higher level position, or people working in the city in a higher level position. They can't find housing. And I see these people personally. They're trying to rent a 2-bedroom apartment from me because there's nothing else available. And at one point now with Zillow and so on, they will say, well, you can look up my current home and it's a 4-bedroom, 2-story with a 3-car garage. And they're saying, this is what I'm looking for. And that doesn't exist in the city limits. Certainly there are places where it could be built. But again, I appreciate Councilor Rocca's acknowledgement that workforce housing is not the only type of housing that is in short supply, and people who are employed, 2 wage earners in a home or higher paid professionals deserve to be able to find housing in Astoria as well. So I do, again, encourage the council to consider the importance of that type of housing, not just high density multifamily.
That's a very good point. I appreciate you mentioning that. And I don't know what the answer is to that. I mean, to some extent, if there were an additional upscale condo building built in Astoria, that would end up freeing some of those homes, I think, because the people I know tend to be seniors that live in the condos. They used to own one of those 3 or 4 bedroom homes in Astoria, and then they moved into the condo when they were no longer able to take care of a home. And there are probably a lot more people, seniors that are living in some of those single-family homes in Astoria that would move into a condo if there were more available and free up some of those homes. And then that would free up some of the starter homes. I don't know. I'm not sure what solution were you looking to address the concern you just raised, Commissioner Fitzpatrick?
I sincerely appreciate that statement. It's interesting that you bring up the upscale condos. In my career, I have found that upscale condos are often transitional housing. The doctor that's moving to town that wants the bigger home may buy an upscale condo and live there until his house is built out in the country or in an area where the house that he is looking for can be built. And as you said, a lot of the seniors, if that existed, and if you go to Columbia House, which is, I would say, more owner occupied or full-time resident occupied than the Cannery condos by 39th Street. But when those types of properties, when the upscale condos do exist, people that have lived in the larger 4-bedroom homes will move into those condos because they like it, and they will be with other people that are in a similar situation. And that frees up the inventory of the existing 4-bedroom homes for someone that might need more space, and the people who don't need all that space anymore are able to move into the upscale condo. So it's a very, very good analogy there, and thank you for that, Mayor Jones.
Mayor Jones?
Please.
As we get into some more detail, it looks like I'd like to parallel the conversations of researching these options, all of which I think are reasonable with the refinements that others have kind of mentioned. But the conversation around density, I think, in Astoria is one that needs to be enhanced. We're talking now about specific things, but we've already approved ADUs in all zones. And so there may well be density coming to the your R1 backyard, this spring. I don't know that people understand that, or if it will even be much of an issue. I don't know what the actual results will be, but there's a lot of movement on density. And I think what people are concerned about, their home being their primary investment most times, is why do we have to do this? And so since I've been on the commission learning about Goal 10 and state laws requiring cities to do this, that has allowed me to, as a homeowner, adjust my attitudes about some things we have to do because it's state law and we really don't have a lot of flexibility. And frankly, that's an easier sell to me as a homeowner than it is a selective thing that we're choosing to do. And so the drivers of density, I think, need to be visited as we do the research on this by lots of folks. Because it appears to be here to stay, and it's threatening to homeowners, and it doesn't need to be. I was definitely intrigued, and I agree with the statement that I read in some of the readings, that creative and careful code, written with regard for neighborhood concerns, can reintroduce housing types to neighborhoods. And so I think there are ways to do this, but I sure feel like I would not be up to speed on this had I not been on the commission. And it's an important enough big picture thing that I think we would be benefited to talk about why we need to densify. And then conversations about how we densify, I think, become less sort of strife ridden. And that's all I have for now.
Thank you.
May I add one more comment?
Go ahead.
Thanks. I do recognize that we need housing at all levels, all types, but we have a limited land supply, if I'm understanding what I've read correctly. And people with 2 decent incomes have a lot more choices and buying power to, find something that may not be ideal for them, but at least they've got more choices. Whereas I look at people, our workforce community, who are the backbone of the service industry, that is now a major driver in our economy. They do not have those choices. So I personally feel that we need to focus on trying to bring more higher density types of housing. So duplexes, multiplexes, and within that, hopefully we can do something regarding attracting workforce housing. But I just see that we've got a limited land supply and we want to use it as wisely as possible, not to stuff the city, but just to try to allow more people to live here who work here.
Mr. Estes and Ms. Leatherman, is there any difference at all as we go through these discussions in multifamily units that are owner-occupied units versus rented units?
Well,
I know that certainly, I mean, you can, if you're able to purchase a $350,000 house now, put 20% down, your monthly payment is only about $1,000 a month, I think, not including utilities, and try renting the same size apartment for that. I mean,
Yeah.
is there a difference in how we would encourage multifamily buildings that are owned as opposed to rented, or do you see there being any difference?
Yeah, I mean, so in terms of, and again, right now, this evening, we're talking about things more from the regulatory standpoint. And with regards to the regulatory standpoint, multifamily by law can include rental and or for purchase through a condo. You don't have a difference between a condo use and a apartment use. I'll say that in probably the late 2000s in Portland, condos were the rage, and many apartments were converted to condominiums along the way. And so those are in our land use term repertoire. They're one and the same. They're not differentiated.
Thank you.
If I could.
Yeah, please.
I would point out that a lot of condos, in my experience from what I have seen, and we've got the complex down at 39th Street, as I discussed. I think the last time that we had a survey with the addresses of the mailing address for the owners there, owner occupancy there was about 27%, and that might be different. There's a recently converted condo complex facing Franklin Avenue, but accessed from Grand in the 1100 block. That is also, there are part-time residents in that portion. I think a lot of the condos do become second homes and not necessarily owner occupied. And I would have to very respectfully disagree with Councillor Herman. As a housing provider that provides virtually only workforce housing, our workforce has a very good inventory that they can look at. I'm not sure where Councillor Herman is getting her information, but my firsthand experience is that I have a number of units that I can offer to people in workforce, and the people who want something nicer that it doesn't exist have the right to live in Astoria should they choose to, but they will not choose to live here if they cannot find housing. And I don't have workforce housing people telling me they can't find housing. I have people that are professionals and who, for whatever reason, happen to make more than workforce housing, or I'm sorry, than workforce income people, and that housing does not exist. So again, I would respectfully disagree. My disagreement is based on my experience in providing housing, workforce housing, and not being able to provide or point a direction to where working professionals could live if they wanted to live in Astoria. And I think we have noticed at the city level and the county level, and if you talk to the hospital and some of the larger employers, they are having trouble finding housing for the people in the upper level income. And I don't think that they should be punished for their level of income or their desire to live in a nicer home. I think it's important to remember we need these people here as well as the backbone of the workforce, and we need to make sure that we will have a suitable amount of inventory for those people to choose from so that we can fill the jobs in the upper end as well as the lower end.
And I think that's been my point since I've been on council. That's been the point that I've understood, is that we have a housing problem across the board that we need to increase in all facets. It's not just one or the other, or one over the other. So I think that I look forward to the rest of this discussion and what else you have to offer here as far as options. Because we have actually have a fair amount of housing coming in right now. So keep that in mind as we have this conversation. We have 100 apartments that are going to be showing up in the next year or so. Who knows, we've got the Tongue Point development. If that comes along at a decent pace, there'll be a number of housing created out there. So it's not that it's not happening. It's where can we do a little bit better and make sure we have the opportunities.
Thank you all. I'll turn it back to Ms. Leatherman for this next slide.
Well, this is, thank you, Mayor. Mr. Strategy is, somewhat along the same lines of what we've been talking about as we kind of progress through the conversation. I think with the revising maximum density, height, or bulk standards, what it's really driving at is trying to identify those areas where maybe there would be it would be a good place for a higher density, and then also putting in very clear and objective standards on how that would be compatible, like the step down height they're talking about here, or what types of units potentially would be more compatible if it was up against lower density housing. So I don't know if I have much more to add to this one. And I don't, because I think a lot of you covered it already. I think the key again is finding a balance and creating clear standards. I'll say that right now the R3 zone allows multifamily outright already, but the standards, and I have heard this since I've been here for 8 months, the standards really limit it with the parking being one of the standards, and lot coverage and such, prohibit the conversion. So I think it's definitely worth looking at. Not saying that we'll find the perfect place for this type of thing, a higher density, but I do think that having really clear standards in place instead of more discretionary is important for a variety of reasons. One being that it's better for someone who wants to pursue the project. They know up front what they're getting into. But also, if we look at the specific places where we want that ahead of time, we can create standards that we can all agree will be good for the community in that area and what we're looking for. So this is kind of like diving in deeper to how we could make higher density work within residential zones. And I think if we got the go ahead, we could probably find some areas of that where that would be good.
I would just add that when we had code amendments going to the city council like 5 years ago, there were proposals to revise maximum density, height, and bulk standards in the R1, R2, and R3 zones. This scenario, which is included in the housing study, is just for the R3 zone. So there's not a proposal to increase height mass in the low density or medium density. It's really just in the high density zone. So it's a difference than what came to city council 5 years ago.
Yeah, thanks for making that distinction. And those of you who are either on council or attending council meetings, then remember there was a significant opposition to that. But again, this recommendation is not talking about R1, it's talking about R3. So any comments from the commission?
I'll add, Mayor, that I do think that involving the neighborhood, and maybe looking at sub areas and involving the neighborhood and having a good public process for this type of change would be critical. I agree with what I'm hearing from the commissioners and councilors on that, for sure.
Mayor Jones, I have, in my experience, 6 years on the Planning Commission now, I would say without a doubt, the single greatest resistance item we have seen is height. We've seen that in the commercial zones and anywhere. Any application that's come through that touches on heights or maximum heights draws the biggest crowds. And while I have always been in favor of height, I think the higher buildings don't block views any more than the lower buildings, except in extreme circumstances. I just want to say that this is the single item that draws people out in resistance. But I would certainly be in favor of looking at raising heights in R3 and even in the commercial areas where I think we'll touch on that maybe in the next strategy. Even increasing heights in our commercial zones for high rises, Astoria style high rises of apartment buildings that may be able to go into commercial zones. Anyway, I just thought I'd toss that out there, that the heights is going to meet some resistance.
Thanks, Commissioner. And that is certainly exactly what I was referring to with my earlier comment, that if we were to, as a council, if we were to give the Planning Commission guidance to spend their precious volunteer time developing proposals for increasing heights, that we should be willing to stick to our guns, knowing that there would be some opposition to it if we think that's the right thing to do to increase the available housing in the community. Other thoughts?
This is Commissioner Womack. I agree with Commissioner Moore that this is definitely going to be the one item that we're talking about tonight that will have the most people chime in on. Height is always an issue. I'm also in support of the height increase in both commercial and in the R3. And just to speak to the rest of the councilors about the economic standpoint of being able to provide housing, being able to have a higher structure, of course, gives a developer the ability to provide more units per square foot. So, but again, I think if the council would have to really need to support this, and there would definitely need to be a lot of community engagement for any traction, I would think, on this.
If I could, this is Commissioner Croning. I'd second kind of with the two previous commissioners in that I think one thing that we get challenged with is there's a set of codes that people need to follow, but a lot of the multifamily housing or group housing type ideas still come as conditional uses. And a big one is compatibility with the neighborhood. And the R3 zone abuts R1 almost all the way around Astoria. And so there's the argument of, I live in R1, R3 just happens to be across the street, and this will change our neighborhood. And so when we start looking at, is this compatible with the neighborhood? How does the council want to write this into code so that we can design it compatible? The Planning Commission does have kind of a clear path to approve conditional uses, or maybe even some of these are out of conditional use process if it's agreed that that's the right path forward. So just some of that ambiguity that comes up every time a conditional use comes would be helpful.
That's a great comment. And yeah, the question is, if you live on that street that is the R1, does that mean the only thing that can be compatible is something that looks identical to your street? Or is it something that looks very different but has some transitional architectural features built into it, like those indicated here? So step down heights and facade articulation. I think, you mean, a classic example of this one, I'll just toss it out there, is the former school site at 8th and Irving, which has been, you know, a subject of some previous attempts at development. And there was feelings by some that the only thing that's suitable for that site are single family homes, largely identical in size to the ones on the neighboring street, and others who felt that a multifamily home could be appropriate for that site. Are there any other comments from commissioners or councilors?
I'd like to speak.
Go ahead.
Excuse me. Okay, Brooklyn Henry speaking. So I've kind of just been listening tonight. I have to admit I'm a little undecided on what my opinion is, but in terms of just having a future discussion and getting the public involved. So without doing a really in-depth analysis of the housing study, I know there are some people on the meeting who are kind of experts in all the attached documents. And I'm wondering, and we don't have to answer this question tonight unless somebody wants to, but I'm kind of wondering how urban infill, landslide topography, tsunami topography, all, I know that urban infill is kind of a different topic, but to me, it's kind of a sustainability topic. But in terms of safety and welfare, the tsunami and landslide topography, I just wonder if that's being considered while we're laying out future housing sites and trying to figure out how to increase housing. So that's something that I'd like to make sure that we kind of don't lose sight of that in terms of just letting people build anywhere without any thought of people's safety and welfare, because I feel like when people move here from out of town, they kind of don't know what they're getting themselves into. And I feel like it should be disclosed if people are buying property that's on a landslide or in the tsunami. The tsunami inundation zone is a little more obvious, but there are a lot of active landslides around town, and I feel like people don't really know about them unless they have a background in landscape architecture, engineering, or some kind of a field where they know to look at GIS maps and things like that. So I wouldn't feel good about endangering people or offering people an investment that could be destroyed any more than I would feel good about taking away people's views or overcrowding the city. So I would like to make sure that we take that into consideration if it's not already very clear.
So Mr. Harrington, perhaps, do you want to address if someone is going to?
This is Brett. Let me take a crack
or
at this.
Mr. Estes, either way, yeah. So if someone wants to build a new property, how does the city account for the slide zones in the permitting process?
Yeah, so let me first talk about things from the bigger planning aspect. The state of Oregon does not factor in tsunami inundation zones with regards to urban growth boundary limits. And that is one of the challenges that have been seen for coastal communities is there's the concern about development within tsunami inundation areas, while at the same time, the state does not provide any flexibility on the UGB side. And so that's not a factor that's considered. Additionally, the state would also say there can be properties within slide areas that are developable under the right conditions. So and we know that a lot of Astoria is in historically areas that have slid over the years. That being said, we are and have been continuing to work on a landslide hazard ordinance that would deal with that more specifically. I think this question came up in terms of notice, came up at a more recent city council meeting, and our city attorney had noted, I mean, there are limitations on what can be included on deeds. However, there are, due diligence provisions, that go into play when someone's buying a house. And so, but I mean, I think that can be looked at more, but I think that and we're not gonna be able to answer that question tonight, but there are some limiting factors to be able to consider, Commissioner Henry.
Other questions or comments from the commissioner or the council?
Yeah, so I guess.
Oh, go ahead.
So because they're talking about heights and developments in C3 zones, and I'm just trying to picture Astoria, and where's an example of where we would be building a big, tall building in a R3 zone in Astoria? I just can't, I don't know where that is.
Tongue Point?
Okay, all of Tongue Point?
Yeah, except for the industrial areas.
But that's about it, right?
No, I mean, there are other parcels. I mean, the development that the mayor had mentioned at the beginning of the meeting, over by, that's a commercial zone.
Astor Point?
What's that?
Could Astor Point be built into something that would want to go higher some future time? That location, I don't know the property name now.
Yeah, I mean, I'd have to, I mean, who was putting up the zoning map a little bit earlier? I mean, look at the
To me.
R3 is I mean, if you look, the central area is R3.
It's over here, right?
But I mean, I guess the question is, and that's where I think Ms. Leatherman was talking about, having standards for adjacencies, looking at existing development and how that's ultimately applied. But in terms of larger vacant, if you go to the east, Ms. Leatherman, towards Tongue Point, so if you look at, you have Emerald Heights and the developable land around there, and then there's R2 and then R3. There's the R3 over in Tongue Point.
This?
Yeah, I think that's interesting, and I mean, those properties are very different than the properties on the north slope, the south slope, up on top of the hill where we have a lot of existing residential. And they're like different populations that respond to them, positively or negatively. So I'm just wondering too, how serious of consideration is it when we start talking about heights and whatnot? How many situations are we likely to find that it's going to make a difference one way or the other?
Well, I mean, I think it makes it easier to get support if it's, we're not, this graphic that we're looking at now is not something that potentially then would be foisted on every neighborhood in the city. This is a fairly finite number of areas, and in several of which I think there's nobody currently living to find it objectionable because there's nothing there yet, like the Tongue Point lot, which currently is unbuilt. So just if the council wants to give guidance to the planning commission whether we want them to pursue this or not, I'm in favor of it.
Well,
Yeah.
I especially like it in areas that are currently not developed. If there's a way to limit it to that, because then we're not stepping on anyone's whatever.
Yeah, and I agree with that. I mean, I think that there isn't a lot of development. I think it's a great idea to be able to maximize its potential, because we will have less trouble with that. You know, again, you try and do something like that at the old Lewis and Clark School area, is nothing but trouble.
I think it's worth exploring. I think even in town, I think of smaller multi-story apartment buildings such as the Franklin Apartments fit really nicely into the neighborhood. It's a mix of multifamily and single family housing. So if there were a way we could write the code so that it perhaps restricted the size in a more densely populated neighborhood. But 4 stories to me there does certainly not seem out of scale, whereas it might in some other neighborhoods.
Okay, well, if there's no more comments on this one, let's move along to the next slide.
Okay, so we're moving on to the commercial zones now. And supporting high density housing in commercial zones. Everyone talking tonight seems to be pretty educated on the benefits of having housing closer to town. I'm assuming because of just the smart comments everyone's making tonight. But having higher densities in the commercial zones will help bring residents closer to the services that are provided, that they need, and the amenities. It'll be more convenient for them. It'll be walkable, so it's better for their health. There's a variety of different reasons. And specifically with this strategy, they're talking about adopting a minimum density standard. And what we have right now is on the slide in the C4 multifamily housing is permitted outright. But then in the C1 through C3, there it's not really spoken to. So it's something that I think we could look at and explore further when it comes to a conditional use or not. It does allow single family developments in the C3 below or behind commercial or above. Same thing with the TFD, which is basically a duplex.
Hey, Ms. Leatherman, can you spell out what C1, C2, C3, and C4 zones are for everyone in terms of what the zoning classification is?
Sure. And the names of them, is that?
Yeah, I can do it. I mean,
yeah, I have. C1 is neighborhood commercial. C2 is tourist commercial. C3 is general commercial. And C4 is central commercial.
Yeah, so like central commercial is the downtown zoning district.
Mm-hmm.
So just wanted everyone to kind of have a little bit of understanding in terms of the differences of what those commercial zones are. And to clarify, the mayor was talking about the residential development to the west of the Safeway. That's in a C3 commercial zone to kind of understand conceptually what that type of land may look like.
Another suggestion that the report includes is considering townhomes in the commercial zone. In the C4, they can be developed at higher densities and can provide a good transition area between commercial and residential as an example. I don't really have much.
So do people see some reasons to oppose these recommendations? Any thoughts on these recommendations?
Well, and I would go that, Ms. Leatherman, aren't there, I mean, in terms of allowing multifamily residential, if you go to the other slide, the prior slide, allow multifamily housing outright. There are some zones which do that already.
Yeah, C3 and.
Right. So it's, so there, we have that in place in like, for instance, the city of Warrenton did not originally allow multifamily housing in their general commercial zone. I think they've since modified their code to be able to allow that. But our general commercial zone already included that. I guess the question is, you know, we allow multifamily housing, is it conditionally in the C4 zone? And so, you know, that's, there's that question is, should downtown, should it be allowed outright rather than conditionally? The tourist commercial zone is actually a zone which we're working to do away with. It's kind of been one that's that we've actually been rezoning away from over time. And the C1 zone is an example of C1. The neighborhood commercial zone is around up on Niagara near the Peter Pan Market. That would be an example of C1 zone.
So any thoughts on these recommendations?
I'm not sure if there's any other, I'm trying to see if there's any other C1s, neighborhood commercial.
Over in Alderbrook,
Okay.
over by the Alderbrook Park.
Yeah, those can be really successful. But again, I think the standards that are in place are really limiting them from being successful right now with parking and such. And that would be something we would look at based on this recommendation if the city council wanted us to.
Mr. Mayor, Commissioner Moore here. I would support those recommendations. I'd also like to re-emphasize that increasing heights for residential structures in commercial zones might be something we could consider. If in a C4 or C3, for example, there's a height limit for commercial uses, I would not be against bumping that up if someone wants to add a couple of stories for residential, for apartments or whatever. So something to think about.
I would similarly be in favor of approving these. I presume that we're moving on to parking. If we're not, then I would like to address parking at this point, but otherwise I'm in favor of the recommendations.
Yeah, the next strategy is parking.
The next, okay, so we will go to strategy 5. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm in favor of exploring these recommendations.
I am too.
I'm not opposed to the concept. I just feel like I need more information.
Those are the concepts. I think that height will probably be the biggest obstacle.
Okay, well, if there's no other comments, we can move on to the next one.
Yeah, so this deal again with parking and trying to make housing easier in a variety of types. When I say that, because parking is one of the factors that is limiting it right now. So scaling the requirements by number of bedrooms. Right now, the single family dwelling requires 2 parking spaces. Providing a credit for on-street parking, allowing shared parking and providing reductions or waivers. We have a little bit of, we have the targeted reductions or waivers. There's a section in the development code that addresses that. But the parking standards, I guess that's the question, is do you want us to investigate how a reduction in the parking requirements for single family homes or other dwelling types?
Yeah, I would add on, there are jurisdictions in the state of Oregon that have reduced the number of required parking places for single family residences to be a minimum of one space. And the state of Oregon's Department of Land Conservation and Development model code for rural communities also recommends one parking space, a requirement of only one parking place. I know that at least in League of Oregon Cities conversations about affordable housing code amendments, there's sometimes some discussion whether or not the state legislature will say there can only be a requirement of a minimum of one statewide. That hasn't gone into effect, but I guess the question here is, do you want to be able to do that, particularly with single family residences, allowing for some changes to be able to scale requirements by number of bedrooms. We actually do that already for multifamily units. Our code already does that. There's other recommendations providing a credit for on-street parking. It's saying, okay, if there's a street with a good amount of on-street parking, that parking requirements can be reduced. What that will in turn mean is in some cases, there'll be more parking on street. At the same time, I look at our historic residential neighborhoods that were built before cars, and a lot of the homes don't have two parking spaces to begin with within our existing historic neighborhoods. They may have one off-street parking place, but not always. And so that's why you see some of the neighborhoods in the historic neighborhoods in town have more cars parked on the street at all times. And the question is, this could apply infill, it could apply to new development. And I just to be able to set the perspective a little bit more in terms of what this could mean.
Well, I'm in favor of moving in this direction. Again, if it's good enough for the historic neighborhoods, it could be good enough for new development.
Yeah, I have to agree. If you go up 8th Street and you look around, there's some of the homes on 11th, they're all parking on the street. So I think we should streamline this and take a good look at it. Just if we're going to increase housing, we can't limit people's use of their vehicle, I guess.
So I don't mean to interrupt. Councilor Hilton, I'm not able to hear you, and I would really, I look forward to meeting you in person. I don't know if your microphone is not on or what might be going on there, but I wasn't able to hear any of that.
I'm sorry, Sean. I guess I have to talk really loud. Can you hear me now, Sean?
Not well. Are other people able to hear Councilor Hilton? I've turned my hearing up, but
it's pretty low. So maybe Councilor Hilton, if you just speak loud and get right up to the microphone, it might make a difference. Those mics are a little funny.
Especially with the mask.
Maybe if I take my mask off.
Yeah, well, still a little light, but you just get your mouth right up to the microphone might help.
Can you hear me now, Mr. Fitzpatrick?
A little better, thank you.
I would say that on-street parking in Astoria, if you look in the historic districts, like Brett was saying, you look on 8th Street and you look up 11th Street, you look in those neighborhoods, that's the way our community was built. Even Bond Street, you know, there's a lot of those homes were built without cars in mind. So if we're gonna increase housing, we need to streamline some of the requirements we're gonna put on future homeowners and future development. So there has to be a way for us to maybe encourage people to get out of their cars also.
Thank you.
I might add that it's my strong belief that, first of all, I agree with all the bullet points here. I think we should explore this, but I would add that it's my strong belief that we as a society have reached peak parking. We aren't going to need more parking than we currently have. It's especially in Astoria, I don't expect our population to grow much. Maybe it'll grow some, but looking into the future, and it might be 10 or 20 or 40 years into the future, we will eventually have vehicles that drop us off and go park themselves. And we aren't going to need parking in front of businesses, and we won't necessarily need to park at our house. They might drive off and charge themselves somewhere else. So I really don't see, looking forward deep into the future, that we need to focus on providing lots more parking. And I'm strongly in favor of starting to reduce those requirements right now.
You know, I think that those are interesting observations, Commissioner Moore. And I kind of wonder where those cars are actually going to drive off to get charged, because again, we don't have space for that either, it appears.
They will go to the hole in the ground.
Well, hey, be gentle on the hole in the ground. But I think that you may be right about peak on vehicles, and hopefully vehicles will actually become smaller as well to create more room, and that people will be less reliant on motor vehicles, with the exception that we're still sort of we're not in a large urban area where we have mass transportation as an alternative. We're still sort of stuck if we really want to get around in vehicles, so we're going to have them. And I do get concerned about, this argument, well, it was good enough for historic homes, it's good enough for new homes. I don't buy that. I think we're in a different age. I think it's archaic. It's just circumstantial that we're stuck with no parking in some of these older homes. Those that have garages are too small to fit a modern vehicle. So we're stuck with that. That's just the way it is. But that doesn't mean going forward, when we have new homes, that we don't maintain adequate parking as part of the requirements for that coming in. I mean, I had a problem with being forced to eliminate parking as an issue when adding ADUs, because now we can add ADUs to any single family home, whether it has parking or not. And so we get more vehicles in the street. We have a lot of narrow streets that, you end up having 1-lane roads to go up and down because of all the cars parking along the side. So I think it is an issue. And I think that we need to think seriously about what we are. If we're going to try and reduce parking requirements, we need to be very careful about that, as far as I'm concerned. But all this is worth exploring, and I'm willing to look at more details as they come down. But again, also, we're here not to just load on to the Planning Commission. We want to make sure that it's realistic.
Right. I had a few comments, if I could.
Go ahead.
Okay, so I appreciate the comments of City Manager Estes, Councilor Hilton, President Moore. I look forward to, I hope I'm around in 40 years to see that. And Councilor Brownson made some good comments as well. Getting back to the housing study on page 16, and the graphic that we have up here. I appreciated a number of points in the housing study, and one of them was the scale requirements by number of bedrooms. And I agree completely with this statement. And I would point out that in most cases, the closer to the downtown core that people live, or a good percentage of workforce housing or workforce members are employed, the fewer cars per bedroom or per unit. So as we say the Merwin, it will be interesting to see how that affects, because I think a large number of the people there won't have cars. And in my own experience with my rentals, the smaller the unit, the fewer the cars. I do want to be careful. I'm aware of a few cases where families with no off-street parking and minimal frontage have 3, 4, or 5 cars. And I don't mean to embarrass anyone, but it's a reality. There are 2 homes within 100 feet of my office that have 3, 4, and 5 cars per unit, 25 feet of frontage, and no off-street parking. This leads to a real issue, and at some point we either have to incentivize people whose homes have no off-street parking and minimal frontage to reduce the number of cars that they own, and I don't know how that looks, but I prefer that over the alternative, which would be to de-incentivize the ownership of large numbers of vehicles, meaning neighborhood parking districts and limiting the number of parking permits per home. So again, I don't know how that looks, but again, in most cases, the smaller the unit and the fewer the bedrooms per unit, the fewer the cars, but there are still those households that collect vehicles, and it does create a parking issue for others. The allow shared parking, again, from the housing study, and the graphic here in an application that we had in front of us sometime in the past year, I stated that my vote regarding shared parking pre-pandemic was different than my vote during the pandemic. And I would state that residential, contrary to what the housing study says, and I don't think that in 2017, 2018, they were looking toward the pandemic, but during the pandemic, the residential spaces do not clear out during the day as they did in the past. As someone who's around his properties on a regular basis, and I notice the parking patterns, which are highly unusual, but I won't get into it at this point. The patterns have been, since the pandemic, that the cars are there more often than they had been in the past. So I don't know how often those cars will be moving. So that could create issues that we had not foreseen or even considered, and certainly that hadn't been considered in the housing study. Thank you.
Thanks, Commissioner. Councilor Herman, did you have your hand up?
I did, yeah, thanks. I like the strategy, but getting back to what Councilor Brownson said and what Commissioner Fitzpatrick touched on, I am concerned about where the cars are going to go, because the coast is still a place where you really need a vehicle to be able to get around for the most part. And I think most people come with one vehicle per person if they're adults. So that's a thought that concerns me.
And I think that Commissioner Fitzpatrick sort of nailed it there too, because it will be interesting post-COVID, because a lot of people are working from home right now. And though some will go back to work, a lot of people are going to continue now to work from home. They've seen how it works, and that definitely will impact the parking.
Okay, well, do any counselors object to exploring this one with considerations that have been offered?
No, I think it's well worth exploring.
I'm good.
Okay, then let's move on to the next one.
Okay, strategy number 6 brings us back to housing in residential zones. And it suggests that we allow what is termed the missing middle as a outright permitted use. The missing middle includes housing types like duplexes, triplexes, garden or courtyard apartments, cottage cluster and townhomes. Graphic here. I think what is a key takeaway from this with allowing it, if we were going to allow it outright, is to ensure the housing type is compatible with the neighborhood. And again, I kind of mentioned this earlier, but we do have a zone, it's called compact residential, that has not been identified anywhere in Astoria. I think that would be very good potentially to identify maybe a location where we would want that and allow units like this or cottage cluster, for example, because we also have that. It's printed outright in the compact residential zone. And that's just a suggestion based off of the recommendation from the housing report. But again, it's limiting the building size to be compatible. And again, public involvement, I think, would be important. And like all the other ones, this is trying to address the housing needs that we have. So, Brett, I think there's some background history on the CR zone that you maybe wanted to touch on.
Yeah, so I'll touch on a couple things. So first of all, the CR zone, which allows for the cottage clusters, was developed as a part of the Riverfront Vision Plan implementation. And so there were parcels of land along the waterfront that include the city-owned public works shops site, as well as the property formerly owned by George Brew, now being developed as residential, that under the Riverfront Vision Plan were to be developed as more of cottage residential development. And part of the concept was to allow higher density residential within that area, but not as tall or as massive in structure. That was recommended by the Planning Commission to the City Council. George Brew at the City Council public hearings testified in opposition to the rezoning of his property to allow cottage cluster, and the City Council agreed and did not rezone any of the properties to allow cottage cluster development. However, the text was adopted. So we have allowances for this type of use, but the map amendments were never approved by the City Council. One of the items that it's included in the housing city is that cottage cluster development is a way to be able to achieve higher densities, but maybe not at taller heights. It's used in infill situations quite commonly because you don't have specific lot lines. If you'll go to that exhibit showing a cottage cluster development. You can see here, this is a case where if there's home ownership, this is done by a condominium type of situation. And you have shared parking and shared ownership of open space, but it's still a single family dwelling. This is something that could be considered for the central school site, perhaps, as a possibility. But that's the history on the cottage cluster issue. With regards to the missing middle concept, this is part of what the state legislature is now requiring cities of 10,000 and more to start allowing duplexes outright in single family zones. And it's prescribing that cities of a certain size must amend their development code you know, to comply with certain provisions, which the legislature says will assist with that missing middle housing. So that's got kind of tied in as well in terms of to this whole concept.
Well, I think this is a very positive direction for us.
Other thoughts?
I agree. I love the idea of more compact residential developments, particularly smaller single-family homes for buyers who can't afford a $400,000 house, which seems to be around the going rate these days in Astoria. So I think this makes a lot of sense and would really fit in with our character.
So I guess I'm just to clarify, what I'm hearing there is there's some interest on the cottage cluster concept, kind of integrating that throughout the community. I'd like to be able to get some thoughts on, you know, more of some of these other types of housing in some of our lower density zoning districts to be able to accommodate more duplexes, triplexes within some of our lower density zones.
Well, I was including that in my enthusiasm.
Okay, just want to make sure that was clear.
I support that as well. Would that include the R1 zone?
It could. I mean, I guess that's
I guess, yeah. I'm thinking more the R2, R3. But, you know, again, I'm trying to keep an open mind.
So if I could.
Go ahead.
So I agree. Strategy 6 there, page 17, I completely agree with the statement and would again remind that we do have a missing middle class housing group as well. And the missing middle can satisfy a part of that. And I do love cottage cluster housing. I would just remind that it's important to limit the size of the housing so we don't wind up with another mill pond situation. And limiting the square footage was part of what we had discussed as the Planning Commission in 2013 and 2014 that Mr. Brew asked the council to reject. If we do have an opportunity to provide cottage housing somewhere else, I hope that, again, we do limit the housing because that's where it works. And people who are willing to live smaller, and so you wind up with a smaller footprint of the house and then a little more common area that doesn't make it feel so crowded. And again, the cottage cluster housing is a fantastic alternative to the larger homes on larger lots. And it certainly allows people with lower income to purchase their own home, or even people who can afford something larger to live smaller, which allows the larger properties to go to the households that need the larger space.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think that I like them personally better than condos, right? So not to have a shared wall with somebody, you know, if I'm selling my home because I want to simplify, and I will get there, something like that would be much more appealing probably than what a condo would be. And I think that any place we can do that would be great. I was out in Sisters, and they have a new development on their west side, and it looks like cottage cluster is part of that. And it's a lovely part of the community. It's very nicely done, and it's attractive. And I think we can do those sort of things here. You know, we have Tongue Point, we have that, the old school area there. So I'm in favor of it. I'm a little bit more skeptical about duplexes and triplexes in R1 zones, but I'm comfortable in R2 and R3 where we have reasonable lot size. And again, I'm not sure personally how, I'm not totally comfortable with going after density. I want additional housing, but density I want to be careful with.
Okay, I support the strategy for the different types of housing, not just the cottage clusters. I agree with Commissioner Fitzpatrick that I would want to limit the size of the individual detached single-family homes in those cottage clusters so you don't end up with the homes the size of the one you may have been referring to, Mr. Fitzpatrick, has recently been built. That was not really in keeping with the Mill Pond concept.
And Mayor, if I may, just for information, that what ended up happening is people were, who purchased, they would purchase 2 lots and combine them. So that would be something that we could look at with this cottage cluster if we went that way.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
And just to let you know, there is the Mill Pond development plan allowed a certain number of lots to be combined into double lots. And so that's been tracked by community development staff over the years to ensure that there's not an exceedance in how many times that could happen.
Thank you. Other comments on this topic?
Yeah, I'm in line with my fellow councilors and you, Mayor, that this is a great thing to look at for our community. Definitely is.
And if you didn't hear that, Mr. Fitzpatrick, he supported the concept. Anyone else? Okay, we've, out of courtesy to all of your wellness, it is 7:43. Let's take a brief recess until 7:50. That gives everybody 7 minutes to stand up and stretch and refill your glass. Back, everyone. Thanks for coming back, and we're ready to continue. I think we finished up strategy number 6 with the consensus of council to pursue those. And we're ready to move on to strategy number 7.
Mr. Mayor?
Yes, please.
I thank you. I would like to clarify an earlier comment. There was some speculation about what I meant when I talked about Mill Pond. I was not talking about one specific property, but the project overall. And I want to be very careful about that. In 2003, 2004, my partners and I owned the entire block there between 23rd and 27th. And I believe that the home that people think that I might have been referring to, I believe that I sold the land to those people. And I am not talking about any specific home. I think anybody can make their own opinion about homes that have been built out there. My statement was based on the expectation in the early 2000s and in 2003 when I started buying property there, that it was going to be smaller homes, more modest homes, and geared more towards workforce housing. And if you go down, I believe it's 23rd. I'm not sure if that street is a numbered street still or if it has a name, but if you pull out of the co-op and go right towards the water, there is a single level home. It used to be red. I don't know if it still is, but it after, as you get closer to the water on the left-hand side, there is a single level home there. And the expectation was that that's what people would want there. And it didn't pan out that way. And kind of like we had with a hotel down on the water when we, in the Riverfront Vision Plan, we had said, you can go up to or this wide or this and this, but there wasn't the expectation that someone was going to do all of that. And the trend then in Mill Pond was not so much putting in the modest housing, but people started building to the absolute limits, height-wise, setbacks, and so on. And instead of 800 to 1,200 square foot houses, which again was my expectation, and I thought that designing a home that was just under 2,000 square feet might be too big. It turned out to be one of the smaller homes there. And I'm talking about on the custom lots in that area. Some of the condos and so on were a little smaller or larger, but nonetheless, I was not making a comment about any specific property there, but the overall expectation had been 800 to 1,200 square feet, and then they wound up with the 1,200 square feet being the smallest, 2,000 being the next smallest, and much larger from there. So I do want to clarify that our interest in limiting the home size in the cottage development was so that we would have 600 to 1,200 square foot homes for people who wanted to live small. So we didn't wind up with people buying a lot with our expectation that it was going to be a 600 or 700 square foot home and someone putting a 2,000 square foot home on there.
So thank you. Yeah, thanks for that clarification. And I apologize for incorrectly inferring what a particular house you're referring to. And I appreciate that background too on what the expectations were. And I guess the lesson learned there is if we want to have cottage clusters or any other type of housing of a certain size, let's be very specific in what's allowed and what's not allowed.
Yes, and I'm not suggesting that anyone else was wrong in thinking that that's what I was saying. I should have been more clear, so I take full responsibility for not having been more clear in my statement. But I hope that that there's a better understanding of what I intended in my ambiguous statement. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so we can we kind of talked about cottage clusters, but we didn't have this slide up. So what more do we want to say about this, Ms. Leatherman?
I don't think much more. I think, again, just underlining the conversation just now about, regulating the size of each cottage or unit. And then, we'll have to develop code standards to ensure that they work the way that we want them to. And then, Chris, we'll work through those details with the code amendment and the planning commission. But I don't have much more.
Okay, yeah, it's consistent with what I was thinking. And are there any other comments or questions about the bullets on this slide, or are we ready to move on?
Can I just add one anecdote about cottage clusters that we should keep in mind? When I lived in Kirkland, Washington in 2004, we were moving out of the area, and there was about a year before they had allowed their first little cottage development near my home. And I think they built 8 little 800 to 1,200 square foot cottages on this plot of land with a central park in the middle. And it all looked great. When we moved out of Kirkland in 2005, those little cottages were selling for about $380,000. And I would just like to point out that while these cottage clusters are neat and would be a great living arrangement for a lot of people, they're not going to do anything to provide affordable housing in any sense, because they'll be very desirable and we're not going to be able to control the prices. They'll be as expensive as any other house in the area. Just thought I'd throw that out there.
Thank you, Commissioner. Are there other comments? Okay, I guess we're, if Ms. Leatherman, if you don't have any more questions from the council about our intent with this one, I guess we can move on.
No, and I mean, the rest, I think it's going to be pretty quick as well, Mayor, because strategy number 8 addresses accessory dwelling units, which we just took through a code The only consideration I think would be if we wanted to allow 2 ADUs per lot outright, or, you know, kind of if we wanted to modify what we've already adopted.
I mean, I personally would not have a problem using the language on the slide about allowing 2 ADUs if one was internal or attached. So it didn't look like you had 2 completely separate little houses on your lot besides the primary house, but it would look the same as if you built an ADU next to your primary house and then converted your basement to an ADU. From outward appearances, it'd be no different to the neighborhood.
Well, this is where I would have to disagree. Again, sure, outwardly it would look the same, but again, I get back to the density. So if these are already being allowed in R1 lots, which are already small and parking is already limited, and to have 3 on a 5,000 square foot lot, I just think we're just asking for trouble when we do that. I think expanding to everybody getting to have one is more than enough for our community.
I would agree with that. I think the concern would be we really don't have many ADUs at this point, so we don't know what the repercussions, if that word is allowed, might be. And I would strongly recommend seeing how one ADU works out. We happen to be in the boom portion of the real estate cycle. 10 years ago, we had 30% vacancy. Population hasn't changed too much, but we are at a housing shortage at this point. Let's see how one ADU works. And then consider allowing more later if it is necessary. Allowing 2 ADUs basically is saying we're allowing a triplex in a single family zoning, which doesn't really even exist anymore, but it's going to have quite an impact on the neighborhood.
I might go back just one step further too. When we were first talking about ADUs back 4 years ago and did our first zoning amendment to allow ADUs, my thoughts then, and I think are still the same, the number of people that will actually build ADUs, I think will be few. I think testament is what Commissioner Fitzpatrick just said, is that, you know, there are a few ADUs in town, but very few, and we'll wait and see, but I just don't think we'll see a lot of that.
And my concern being that because of the cost, there aren't going to be as many ADUs as people might think, because they certainly cost a lot more. And then the people who are interested in building them find out what laws are, the laws that are restricting what housing providers can do and making it harder to be a housing provider. And so they decide not to do the ADU. So what we will have, especially with the removal of the owner occupancy requirement, is people will be coming from out of the area, buying a single family residence in an R1 zone, turning it into a triplex, and you will have a larger number of people living in the area than was intended or expected, certainly for the neighbors, and an out of area owner who may not be taking care of the issues that triplex is creating for the neighborhood. So yeah, so you may have one triplex and no ADUs anywhere else, or no de facto duplexes anywhere else for quite a while. I would really like to see how a duplex in a single family residence works before we start allowing a triplex, especially if we are going to remove an owner occupancy requirement. And I would prefer not to, but I'm not sure if the state allows us to do that.
Thanks, Commissioner. Commissioner Price.
Thank you. if I recall correctly, over a period of, I don't know, 3 or 4 years before the council started talking about ADUs 4 years ago, there had been something like 4 or 5 permits. It was very, very low. But in the intervening 4 years, we have more and more people who are buying homes from out of the area. They have much deeper pockets. And we also have the issue now of investors buying homes. And so these are people who have deeper pockets. They have more of an ability to build ADUs. And so just to build on what Commissioner Fitzpatrick was just saying, that I think it's prudent to do what the state has required us, which is to allow 1 ADU, and see how that goes over. I would give it, 4 or 5 years, and see how that works before allowing 2.
Thank you. Any other comments?
Yes. I will just say, I think it's worth exploring in the R3 zone. This can be a way that home ownership is more affordable. So I look at it from the other side as well. So I think it's worth our looking at.
I agree. And I even think that looking beyond the duplex to the triplex is worth considering, because some of those, I've seen some units that are triplexes that are very tasteful. And I know that, you can't write taste into the code, but still, I think it's worth discussing.
Thank you. Councilor Hilton, any comment?
Yeah, I'm along with Mr. Fitzpatrick and also with Tom Bronson. I believe that just one, I think 1 would be a good limit to start with, and then we could make an adjustment, because if we establish 2, we can't go backwards once they start putting them in there. And I would also look to the future and say, what if all of a sudden it just stops? So, and that means growth. All of a sudden, what if it just crashes? So those are my thoughts.
Thank you. Councilor Rocca, any comment?
Yeah, I think I'm sort of in the same place, where let's see what happens with 1 before we go to 2.
Okay, so that on the issue of considering allowing 2 ADUs, that's the consensus of the council, is to hold off on looking at that. Other than that, we've already implemented the state requirements. So going on to strategy number 9.
Yes, so this speaks to incentivizing affordable and workforce housing. And right now, staff is recommending that we address this separately as its own topic and not included as part of this amendment, because it will require additional administrative capacity and oversight, but also because it's going to necessitate a lot of collaboration with other partners and discussions that I think are separate a lot than what we're talking about right now.
Yeah, and I would add on, I mean, this is really not as much development code oriented as much as looking for other ways to incentivize. And I think this could be another subsequent work session topic that gets into a whole lot more specific detail, which is very much more council directed, because it may come down to dollars and cents and policy levels. So we were not looking at any direction from council tonight, but looking at coming back to this at a later time with more discussion. So.
Okay, that's a good plan. And I do think we have a few members of the public who are attending specifically to talk about affordable housing. So we'll offer them the opportunity to make a comment at the end on this topic, even though we're not going to tackle it tonight. But yeah, I would agree that this is going to be a standalone topic. Are there any comments from commissioners or council on this at this time?
I look forward to seeing this as a specific meeting, because there is so much here. I would just add, in addition to, since we're in policy and development code, it says provide expedited permitting for projects with affordable units. And I would add the importance of local municipalities communicating with the elected officials in Portland and Salem about the negative effect that the so-called tenant protection laws that have been enacted in the past 5 years have had on the housing supply, because it is negative, and it has done nothing to help with this, and it has chased people like myself out of the housing market and resulted in more corporate housing providers and fewer mom and pops like ours. And while it's very rarely discussed in general, it is a well-known and very highly discussed topic within the profession. And again, at a larger meeting, we can get into that, but I do think it's important that local municipalities have to communicate to Portland and Salem that their whatever works for them or whatever they believe might work for them does not work for us.
And that certainly would be true across a broad spectrum of policy issues.
Right?
I would be happy to, if you would like to write up a sort of concise summary of those key points, that I would be happy to convey those at what opportunities I have to do so.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
You're very welcome. So in that case, let's move on to the next slide.
So what within the city of Astoria, we call short-term rentals homestay lodging. And I believe we have addressed all of these, except we do not collect a tax or assess a penalty fee. We do require a license and charge for a license and a renewal every 2 years. But it's not necessarily a tax. The rest of it, we have addressed already and adopted a code recently.
Yeah.
Now, isn't there a penalty fee if we find somebody illegally renting out a whole house as a short-term rental? Is there not a penalty for that?
Yeah, Mr. Mayor, we deal with it on a case-by-case basis. We don't necessarily have a set fee with the code enforcement component. A lot of time, I think it's a legal situation. Legal kind of situation, and when it gets to that,
yeah, the municipal court judge would assess a penalty fee if it was taken to court.
Okay,
so only if it goes to court. So
right.
if we either find on our own or it's reported by someone and we look into it and someone is illegally renting a house, and if they comply, then there's no penalty. It's only if we have to take them to court that it gets to be a penalty. So
yeah,
what's the deterrent to doing it?
Yeah, the whole thing is then you're going to go through the process of going through municipal court, and if it's found in violation, the judge, is able to assess a penalty if found guilty, for violating the code.
And what's the current status of our internal resources, manpower, to be able to periodically just check and make sure? At some point a year ago, there was a report made that we feel like we've gotten those under control, and there are very few, if any, that were actively illegally renting out their homes. Are we able to periodically check that still?
We do periodically check it. Yes. We could do a better job, honestly, but yes. And like we've talked about with the city council goal setting about the community development resources and the need, I think it's tied to that if we want to improve it.
I will say that, Ms. Leatherman, we've gone through, you want to talk a little bit, we've gone through our first renewal period for those licenses, and maybe want to talk briefly about going through that process. That is something that we did do this last year.
Yeah, we required every 2 years they're required to do a review, a renewal of their license, and we ask that they get a fire inspection, safety inspection, life safety fire inspection. And each one of the licensed homestay permitted individuals went through that. And so we do have quite a few that are in compliance. And we do periodically check Airbnb and those other types of sites to see if there's any out there that we're not aware of, because we do have a list and keep track of them at this point in time.
And Mayor, I would note one thing, Ms. Leatherman said we don't collect taxes. We don't have a tax on the use itself, but we do collect transient lodging taxes. And remember, we do have another agenda item after this, which actually is the focus of the issue that Ms. Brooks is going to be talking about, the transient lodging tax collection.
Yeah, and I'd like to add to that, I was just going to point those two things out, and on the next agenda item, that will be one of the things that potentially, in working with the state, will have the ability to identify locations of homestays that might not have been in compliance or that we can't find otherwise. We'll have just another way of finding those and be better able to enforce homestay violations. And I think we did a really good job in setting up the code for homestays. We did it very proactively and to protect our housing.
I'd have to say I'm surprised about the penalty fees. Perhaps my recall is faulty, but I thought when we passed the prohibition on whole house rentals that we had also approved a fee of $1,000 per day for violation.
That is correct. However, that is issued by the code enforcement officer, but can only be assessed by a judge. Because then there's a fee, but remember, everything is determined by a legal process, and it doesn't stick with staff. It's part of it's the part of the legal process. If you get a citation for speeding, it's ultimately, if it's taken to court, ultimately the judge is the one. I mean, the person can pay the fee, but the thing is it's ultimately convict. If they challenge it, that's where these go. The threat of a fee is what gets people to comply. And so, yes, there are ways to be able to say, okay, there's going to be these fines in place, but then it goes to court, and that's where the judge can also reduce fees, can change that, and it's all part of the whole code enforcement legal process.
Okay, then it looks like we're ready for the last slide, which has to do with Astoria land supply.
So I'm going to touch on this right here, and I mentioned the urban growth boundary issue earlier. This Astoria land supply, there is a recommendation in the county housing study to look at the buildable land inventory and address urban growth boundary issues. At the council's goal setting session, I mentioned this, that going through an urban growth boundary amendment is a very time-intensive, labor-intensive, politically intensive, and cost-intensive process. And I do want to clarify something that Commissioner Fitzpatrick mentioned earlier, that we're hemmed in. We are hemmed in, of course, on three sides by water, but we are not hemmed in to the east. There is federal ownership to the east. However, there are a number of parcels that are inside our city limits, but outside our urban growth boundary, owned by the county and by the city. These are parcels that, through an urban growth boundary amendment process could be looked at and determined where there could be any expansions or any swaps to take out that federal ownership. And then there could be the discussion with the county and with the city as to transfer of ownership of those lands. It should be noted that if we are talking about urban growth boundary swaps or amendments to address our state noted deficiency, that will be to the south and to the west of Coxcomb Hill, in what is many times seen as our urban forest. And so the question is coming saying, does the city council ultimately want to be able to address that urban growth boundary swap issue that's included in our buildable lands inventory, and also to address our single family deficiency? If so, this will be needing to be looked at several years out. We would be looking to see whether or not there was any grant monies. The Department of Land Conservation and Development used to have a more robust grant process. However, with funding constraints at the state level, those were becoming more and more of a challenge. And if the council wanted staff to do that, we're going to need to build that into the community development departments and public works departments work plan. Both departments would be highly engaged, and we would need to start looking at budgeting for that. I get questions from counselors periodically about what happens if we don't address the deficiency. And I think that may have come up when we had the land use training session with our DLCD rep, Lisa Phipps, earlier this year. There used to be something which is called periodic review that cities had to go through to ensure that cities were in compliance with statewide planning goals, like the 20-year land supply. That is not happening as regularly due to budget issues at the state level, and just the intensity it was taking. So I'm wanting to put that out there to say, is this something that the council is wanting to hold off on? And this is not a quick and easy, fast goal, but if it's something that the council wants us to start working on, Ms. Leatherman and myself and Public Works Director Jeff Harrington will need to be starting to look out several years to be able to plan for that. So that's just kind of a policy question more for the city council.
There's some significant things on staff's plate this year. I'd hate to throw this on there right now. That urban forest west and south of Coxcomb Hill, how much of that, has it been assessed for buildability? It seems like it's an awfully steep terrain area and not an easily buildable area, or am I wrong?
Yeah, and so first of all, I am not talking about this next fiscal year. We're looking at 1 to 2 fiscal years out, but we need that much time to even start planning for that. I would say that that it's there has been a no analysis, and that's what has to happen as a part of an urban growth boundary expansion, is that there has to be analysis taking a look at ease of where the preferred places to be able to develop from topography standpoint, what are the preferred standpoint for providing utility services, what is the best way environmentally to be able to expand, and how's the best way to expand in terms of social aspects, in terms of looking at connectivity to neighborhoods and parks and those types of things. It's a whole analysis that would have to be conducted to be able to look at an urban growth boundary expansion. And so that's what would be occurring.
Okay, so I think we'll have to talk about this at a future work session, a little more detail before we would be in a position to give you guidance tonight on whether we want to start planning for this several years out.
Okay.
And so, Ms. Leatherman, was there anything else on your agenda for tonight?
No, just thank you to everyone, the council, commissioners, and public for attending and providing input and being very well schooled on the report. Made the conversation go very smooth. So thank you.
Thank you for an excellent presentation. And so earlier we had a request by Mr. Levine and by Ms. Sullivan for comments. And so if either of the two of you are still interested in making a comment or asking a question, please do so. You can either unmute yourself or do the raise hand function. Okay, I don't see.
Looks
Mr.
like they're both
Levine.
gone.
I'm not sure if Ms. Sullivan is still on. I don't see her either. Okay, was there anyone else who wished to make a comment? Okay, Ms. Stacy Stahl. You are muted.
Hi, thanks for inviting tonight, the public. My name is Stacy. I'm from JVB Management, and we own 5 buildings in the Astoria and Warrenton area. And I submitted some notes to Megan earlier today in case it's information that might be useful for you to know what the public is asking for as far as apartment rentals. I think it's important, and I haven't heard anything like that tonight, but I understand that isn't exactly the reason for the meeting. Well, it is the reason, but not the core issues. So I wanted to offer myself up as a contact of someone who might be able to help in letting you know what's happening out here in the trenches. While you were talking earlier, I looked online on 2 of the popular websites, rentals.com and Zumper. And I found 3 apartments available in Astoria on one of them, 5 on the other, which is incredibly low inventory. I just wanted you to know. I get approximately 6 calls a day for apartments. We have a waiting list of 34 single people and families looking for rentals right now. Since December 15th, there's been a huge increase, I'm noticing. So I thought that was important to note. Many people moving from outside this area, wondering where they're going to go in tears. So it's a huge problem. And I know that it's also hard for locals, the local workers, which that was addressed, to be able to afford the rentals we have available, let alone the deposit they might have to come up with. So I don't know if I'm speaking for the little guy or not, or what is happening here, but I'm taking an incredible amount of calls. I have nowhere to refer them to. I don't know what to tell them exactly, other than that we don't have vacancies and to be able to put them on a waiting list. And like I said, 34 people on a waiting list is kind of a big deal. So I'm noticing a turn to more calls, more desperation, and less answers. So I just wanted to throw that out, that we're available. I gave the information to Megan. She's got it in writing, and my how to reach me if you need to. So thank you very much for allowing me to say a few things.
Yeah, thank you, Ms. Dahl. It's very helpful. I appreciate that information. Commissioner Price.
Thank you. I just thought I'd go over my couple or 3 or 5 takeaways from the evening. And I suppose the main one is that the council is really interested in the Planning Commission looking at all of these strategies. There are a couple of tweaks here and there. The real work will come into the Planning Commission and staff and council eventually, because there were some cases where you said things like neighborhood specific. And that's always where the trouble comes in, or the difficulties come in, is writing code that allows for what you want to allow for, but only in certain, not even just places like zones, but in certain cases. So that can get tricky. I also heard from mainly, I think, commissioners, but I do think council agreed that looking at perhaps an R4 zone would be interesting. Protecting R1s and R2 zones had some interest on the council. Looking at safeguards to protect the demolition of homes in the R2 area for the purpose of building something larger. And that conversation sort of took place in the context of historic districts or historic homes. But Astoria has a south slope that is not at all designated historic as far as I know. But that place has beautiful views as well, and is a lot of R2 that could be subject to the sorts of economic incentives for demolition and bigger buildings that Commissioner Moore brought up. I was glad to hear that the focus isn't strictly on workforce and affordable housing, at least not rentals, because ownership equity is what builds wealth for people. And we really need to give people, as much as we can, the opportunity to build equity. And let's see what else. But also, one of the big takeaways was to have a greater conversation, a wider conversation about the whys of the things that we're doing, and not just the how. Thought that I had was that when we do increase density in residential neighborhoods, commercial too, but I think we do address lighting. We certainly address lighting in commercial areas. We don't so much in residential areas. And so lighting and noise will need to be considered in terms of increasing density. And let's see, another thing was, there was this, I was a little confused about this business of population not growing. And I don't want to stick just to population, but I do know that there are certain things that kick in that are quite big ticket items, or that change many of the rules that we kind of live by when we go much over 10,000, and if we were to stay there. So, if there are 100 apartment units or some sort of units being built in one place and 40 someplace else, that is an additional 140 people, because they're all new, or so you do have to figure in population growth. It's going to happen if we follow and enact most of these strategies. We will be building for future generations a very different city than we live in right now. And so I just think that's something that we really need to keep in mind and be very clear about, talking about the big picture, because citizens don't have time to get into this nitty gritty. They don't care. It's too nitty gritty, even for some of us planning commissioners who are really dorks about this stuff. So it's really important to show that, yes, this change here looks small, but it could have a large impact. So anyway, that's what I took away from tonight, and thank you.
Thanks, Commissioner.
I'd like to touch on something that Commissioner Fitzpatrick brought up a couple of times. And I fear it's a dead-end road, but one of our issues in terms of availability of housing is second homes. And I guess want to ask again, is there anything at all that is legally possible for the city to do in terms of discouraging purchase of second homes?
There is not a ability to prohibit second home ownership. However, I think the main policy that the city has had in place throughout the years, which has limited those numbers, is not allowing full house vacation rentals in residential zones. I think that's an item that it was a policy that was established many years ago. And that has had a reduction effect because people can't buy it and then, then rent out their full home and generate revenue while they're not using it. I think that more recently, when the council passed homestay lodging code provisions that doesn't allow homestay lodging with kitchens, I think that further went towards addressing that issue. And I would say that even more specifically, we've seen the council prohibit conversions of existing residential units in commercial zones to homestay lodging or to short-term rentals. It's not homestay lodging in a commercial zone, but to short-term rentals. And I think that addresses the issue somewhat in commercial zones. But Councilor, in terms of a flat out prohibition, we just don't, that is a question that we've had conversations with our city attorney about, and he's opined that we just don't have that ability to do that in terms of just prohibiting a second home outright.
And which is why I would, again, reiterate the importance of not removing the owner occupancy requirement on an ADU, so that if someone needs to rent a portion of their home to be able to keep their home, they have that option. But if somebody needs an ADU to augment the income, to allow them to have a second home here, it doesn't help the issue. It creates the issue rather than helping find a solution.
The challenge is this is one of the provisions that the state legislature said we had to remove from our code. So that has been per the state legislature.
The importance of them understanding that Portland's problems aren't necessarily our problems, and their solutions may not be solutions there, and certainly aren't solutions here.
And one topic we're obviously not going to delve into tonight is the issue of incentives and revenue creation through things like construction excise tax and looking at system development charges. But I know that'll be a topic at some future time. We have had the issue that quite a few people have raised to me of derelict homes and vacant homes that are owned by somebody but just not lived in, and they're not trying to rent them out as short-term rentals, they're just leaving them empty. And I remember when I was walking door to door running for mayor a couple of years ago, I was up on a street near Arlene Lemire's house, and a neighbor came out and pointed to me just within view of her front stoop. That house, some guy in California owns it, never comes here. That house, somebody in Portland owns it. They come here like one weekend a year. I was just kind of shocked how many single family homes there are that are owned by someone and not lived in. And I don't know if there's any way, the only way you could identify all those homes would be just really to ask neighbors to point them out and then go knock on doors and have some sort of citizen campaign to try to get homes back being used as residences again. I don't know if that's something where there's enough of them. Some of you that have lived here a long time probably know some of these houses. I mean, is that something that's worth pursuing?
Mayor Jones, you could probably, if the city's software allows it, you could evaluate the water use of homes and run a report on homes that don't use any water for 3 months at a time.
Again, these are houses that are legally owned. They're not violating any laws. And it sounds like there's really still nothing we can do about that. Even if I own a house and I don't live in it, but I own it.
Yeah, it's not against any law. I don't know if it's even worth pursuing, just approaching people saying, hey, we've got a housing shortage in town. How'd you like to sell your house?
I think that this is where it comes into the issue of incentives. And if we did have a program that could incentivize redevelopment, that would be one thing to, we'd be able to, we've had success in code enforcement over the years where we've had, maybe it's a house that's become derelict that is vacant, that we've been able, the one that there's one that's on Niagara that I can think of, and really in that case, the parents had passed away, the kids owned the house, the kids couldn't figure out what they were going to do with mom and dad's house, and it was just sitting there moldering. But it came to the point where it became a code enforcement issue, and through the code enforcement process, they were pushed to do something because the house was just starting to deteriorate. We've had some of those types of successes over the years, but I think could be more talked about in terms of incentives to be able to get those homes back into use.
Thank you. Are there any other members of the public who did want to speak? Just use your raise hand function on Zoom. If not, any last comments from commissioners or counselors? Okay, I really appreciate everyone's time tonight. This has been a little over 3 hours, but it was a really good discussion. Very important topics that are very important to our community members. So with that, I thank you. Have a great evening. Stay safe. Wash your hands. And
Mayor, we still have another agenda item.
Oh, good.
This is just council, right?
Just city council, correct.
Okay, so any commissioners are free to leave. The public is welcome to stay if you like. Other than that, those of you who are leaving, have a great night. Thank you. And city council, stay here for the next item.
Thank you, Mary Jones and staff and other counselors and commissioners.
Thank you, everybody. Good night.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Good night.
Good night.
So Mayor, the next agenda item is coming from Finance Director Susan Brooks. And as I mentioned a little bit earlier, this is dealing with collection of transient lodging tax. You may recall that several years ago, there was discussion about the state starting to collect transient lodging tax and collecting on behalf of cities. And happens with marijuana tax collections and distribution. And the legislature put in some protocols to allow for that. And then there's been, over the past years, development of how this would work through the state. And the state's now started to roll out the program. I think there's some counselors that have participated in some of the meetings about this issue, along with our finance department staff. And Ms. Brooks was prepared to outline what this could look like if the state collected it rather than the city, and looking at those pros and cons on both sides. So I'm going to turn it over to Susan.
Everybody hear me okay? Yes, okay. Thank you for allowing me to bring this to the council. I wanted to give a brief history of the legislative actions that have led up to this point. In 2017, there was legislation passed at the state level, which would allow the state to enter into agreements with local governments to administer collecting lodging taxes. But not much progress was made at that point because there were clarifications that needed to be made. Those were made in 2018. And most recently in 2019, 3 bills were passed that determined that a certain percentage of the collections would be withheld from lodging intermediaries, which created some problems for us and still creates some problems for us because we don't necessarily know who we're getting money from when we get third-party intermediary payments. And it also allowed for the collection process at the state. So the state did hold a meeting on the 22nd of January to interested stakeholders to outline what they could provide and some of the benefits of the state collecting. The tax responsibility would assist with the providers and the intermediaries who are collecting. They're already remitting information to the state. And so having kind of a one-stop shop would assist in the collections and the follow-up. And just so everybody understands, the transient lodging intermediaries include online travel companies and travel agencies. And the transient lodging facilities can include hotels and motels, bed and breakfast facilities, spaces used for RV parking, could actually include erecting a tent during short periods of time. Resorts and inns are part of that, lodges and guest ranches, cabins, some condominiums, apartments, duplexes, and homes, as we've been talking about tonight. Any other type of dwelling unit where a portion of, or in some areas, all of that are used for temporary stays, which is usually defined as less than 30 days. So the Department of Revenue would provide for tax collection. They would provide for filing enforcement. And I want to stress filing enforcement of the taxes, not code enforcement. They would provide for conducting audits on the transient lodging reports and the taxes that are submitted. They would provide quarterly activity reports back to the local government. They would distribute the local taxes, net their expenses. So that's kind of a really broad overview of what could be provided. There is a maximum cost that's proposed right now, and this is probably one of the larger negative aspects of the proposal because it's a maximum amount. I don't anticipate that they would actually have to charge this amount even in the short term, because I think a lot of smaller municipalities, but probably globally across the state, it's going to make sense for more agencies to get on board with this. And the per filer fee on a quarterly basis should go down. But right now the maximum's been set at $175 per filer per quarter. And that means per reporting entity or hotel or motel or third-party entity or a short-term lodging host, we would have to pay $175 per quarter to the state. That would be deducted from our distributions. Currently, that, just doing a pretty round number, that could be about $11,500 worth of fees per quarter, max. I think it would be less than that. I feel that kind of like with other consolidated collections with marijuana tax and everything, as more people sign on, we see those costs from the state reducing. So some of the positive aspects that we would anticipate seeing if we decided to go with this program is there'd be centralized tax reporting and collection. The forms would be standardized through the state. The filing and communications would all be centralized through the state. We would post the information on our website and of course, assist with directing people to the appropriate website, providing links and providing that information if people call. But there's some continuity there. And like I said, any of these agencies or these hosts are already having to file with the state. So they're having to file with the state, they're having to file with us locally, and they're having to file with the county as well. So this would be more of a one-stop shop. The state also has a larger capacity for filing enforcement than we do in our department. We kind of share that those duties. I have one person assigned in the finance department for that, and it's kind of one of many jobs that that person does. Whereas the state would have a workforce that's dedicated to nothing but the transient lodging taxes. Also, the state has a much larger capacity for audit, and because they are a larger entity, their ability to follow through, and maybe not even have to get to the point of following through, but just sending out a letter would probably carry a lot more weight than a small municipality like us. So they also have the ability to follow up on complaints and tips that we would have regarding filing capacity. So if they got a tip or a complaint that somebody was operating a short-term rental and not paying the taxes, they would have a broader bandwidth to follow up on that. We currently probably have 150 to 200 hours a year, and it varies, that are spent by the one staff person, just dealing with the reports, follow-up, phone calls, doing calculations of penalties and interest if those apply. And so that time could be freed up and directed to other tasks that aren't being accomplished right now. This also aligns with the transient lodging ordinance of other municipalities across the state. It makes it easier for the users. So the people who are providing the lodging, they would get a consistent set of rules across all the different agencies if it's consolidated at the state level. And the Department of Revenue has a better ability to work with the third-party intermediaries and the ability to produce better compliance with the larger host platforms than we have the ability or bandwidth to do. The state also would have capacity to cross-check transient lodging tax providers through their databases and research online hosting platforms for compliance as well. So if they see somebody posting online and they're not getting a report from them, they would have additional capacity to check up on that. For some lodging providers, it would actually be a positive to move to a quarterly basis. The city of Astoria actually requires reporting on a monthly basis, and we collect taxes on a monthly basis. So if we move to this platform, it would change it from a monthly to a quarterly. And I know for some smaller entities, that would be preferable. Again, we anticipate that the program costs will probably not be as high as the maximums that have initially been set. And that's based on our experience with the consolidated marijuana tax collections. We feel that we would benefit from reduced expenses associated with the increasing use of the entities in paying for their taxes with credit cards. So we're incurring credit card fees, which reduces the net amount that we bring in. Having that flow through the state, that potentially would be a cost we would not incur. And the other pro is that this really isn't a new program model for the state. And it should, with more participation by agencies such as ourselves, it should enhance the overall data metrics for the state as a whole. So some of the negatives that we see is that the quarterly reporting versus the monthly reporting that we have right now will create a 3-month lag in revenues coming in to the city whenever, if we initiate this at that point in time, we will see a lag in collections and reporting. As I said, the expense that would be netted against the revenue for the collections is a downside. And the time frame that it'd be necessary for us to adjust our code to be in compliance with the required format for the IGA with the state is going to be a little bit of a hurdle for us to get through initially. For establishments that are struggling to meet the obligations of paying their taxes right now, the quarterly filing could mean that they get further behind, and then they could become subject to penalties and interest, and probably have a much stricter oversight from the state, where we've been a little more flexible and worked with them. And it also takes the face-to-face aspect of reporting to the local agency out of the picture. Although I will note that probably 90% of our interactions right now are via email, mail, or the phone right now. So it would be a small percentage that we may deal with on a face-to-face basis for tax collections. For those that maybe 5%, they would not be dealing with us on a face-to-face basis any longer. So we're just looking for some input and guidance, because there will be a little bit of work that will be necessary moving forward to see if this is a direction that council would like us to proceed with.
So my first question, Ms. Brooks, is, do you want, if it were up to you, you're the one that has to deal with this on both ends. Do you want to do this? Is this your preference?
I think this would be a good thing for us. I think that it would be a good thing to have this more consistent for the user as well as for us as the city. Although initially when we got into the program for the marijuana taxes, that was kind of a new department, a new startup, and it was a little difficult. But now that things, the kinks are worked out, it's nice. We did good reporting. And we don't have to chase down people. They get very good compliance. The state just has that bandwidth that they get very good compliance with the program. So we're pretty excited about it. My staff is pretty excited about the possibility.
I support it.
I would say, I think just the thing, there are definitely benefits in terms of trying to get assurance of collections. I think there's some, and comes into the enforcement item that was being discussed earlier with regards to homestay lodgings that Ms. Leatherman was talking about. I think there are definitely some efficiencies there. I think the one thing just the council to be fully aware of is what Ms. Brooks said is removed is those folks, those hoteliers, those homestay lodging owners would no longer be working with folks in Astoria, but rather folks in Salem. And if there are issues or if they get behind, we don't have ability to nuance those because the state will be managing the contract. So that's something just to be aware of and understand from a policy standpoint.
And I would like to add too that we still would be dealing with the code enforcement issues. That would not be so that is separate from the tax collection issues. And so we still would be dealing with those people, those entities, as far as if they're following the proper code requirements for the zone that they're in and reporting correctly. But as far as the tax collection, that would be handled by the state.
Well, in addition to some money that would be saved in terms of our staff time, Do you also foresee, Susan, that there would be perhaps better compliance and better remittance, particularly by those more distant entities in this case?
I do. That is exactly what we've seen from the inception of the marijuana tax program to where we are now, that there is better compliance.
Which would tend to offset some of the cost of us doing it.
Yes. And I would like to say too, the audit aspect is pretty attractive to me as well, because it would cost us additional funds to hire somebody to do the audit. We don't have the capacity right now to go out and audit a hotel's books. We have the ability to in there. We have the ability through our agreement with the tax collector person at each host or inn or hotel, but we don't have the capacity in the department in staff to send somebody to a hotel and spend a week or a month looking at their books and comparing those with the reports. We could hire somebody, an accounting firm, to do that, and it's, it would have to cycle because you would never hit all of them in 1 year. But the state has a much larger capacity to do that type of activity as well.
Yeah, I've been in favor of this generally since it was first brought up to my attention. And I know that the state is rolling it out now also because they've increased their capacity. They've upgraded their systems so that they're able to do a better job tracking all this stuff. So just their ability to do that and to collect all the taxes that are there, and that our city departments get a little relief, just one less thing, we can focus on more important things to our city than trying to track down these things. And we're trading nuance for a hammer, I think, as far as collection goes. So I think that's all right. And I hope that financially it sort of evens out. But even at, if it costs us a little bit more to go this way, it may be money well spent.
I agree. It sounds like the positives far outweigh the negatives.
I'm just thinking, trying to take it all in. I think if it streamlines the work that you have to do, Susan, and if the state is able to get that money for us, which we need, and yeah, there'll be some lag time is what you're saying. But as long as we get the money, that's the important thing. And if they have the power to enforce it and power to audit, I think that's a very, very important key, even though there are friends and neighbors and they are hotels. It's important. So I agree. I think you should go for it.
Unanimous.
Very good.
All right, that was easy.
Yeah.
All right, I didn't have another 2 hours of presentation for you.
We are too.
Well, if you could put the numbers up on the screen for it, just kidding.
I have some, but.
All right, is that it for the agenda, Brett?
That has got it.
Okay, very good. Thanks everyone for sticking around tonight and getting it done.
Yeah, great meeting.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night.
See you in early March.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Good night.